Hey there, Hearth Guy here, and this is the compilation of my tour guide to Destiny and its factions. Destiny has been a game and a story that's been with me for a decade, which is a little under half my life at this point, and through its ups and downs, the trials and tribulations of being a fan of Destiny, it's a world and story that has remained in my head. I'm not secretive about my disappointment with how Destiny has been handled, especially recently, but just on the merits of world building, it's one of my favorites. And while I may not be the lore master that is My Name is Bife, who you should definitely check out if you like any of these, I hope to share all that I love about Destiny here and now, as I bring you along for this tour guide. So sit back, grab a snack, like, comment, and subscribe, and all that, and enjoy the dive deep into the great expanse that is Destiny. In ages long past, as humanity first took a step into the beyond, they encountered something that would change everything. For better or worse. It was magnificent. It was white. It was a ball. And it was about to make humanity's time and space very, very fun. For a whole 3 seconds before the ball's natural predator, the pyramid, took a personal issue with that. None of what I said was technically lore inaccurate. Hey, I am the Hearth Guy, and yes, you're reading that right. I am indeed talking about the wide, wonderful, bloated, and whimsical world of Destiny. Created by Bungie, the studio once acclaimed for making people want to buy the Xbox. For those who don't know or don't care, Destiny is a world that falls into the amazing category of fantasy pretending to be sci-fi, because there is very little science in this fiction. We have space wizards that make Jedi look like tools, and crayon eaters that make space marines look calm, and whatever those cracked out weirdos are up to. These are the best idea Bungie ever had that involved large armored men and blue women. The Guardians. The ultimate defenders of humanity, except when they aren't. Champions of the light, except when they aren't. And eternal undying bastions of hope, except when they aren't. The running, gunning, stunning Guardians that, alongside the little cue balls called ghosts, are almost entirely unkillable. Well, they can be killed, but keeping them killed is a very tricky problem. The ghosts will just revive their partnered Guardian and continue whatever unhinged bloodsport or active xenocide they were previously up to. Not to spoil anything, but they have killed multiple beings that can easily be classified as gods over the decade-long story of the game. And I'm fairly certain that more than half have been turned into weapons of some kind that are now used freely in televised gladiatorial death matches. Again, none of what I said was technically incorrect. I can confidently say that they are, at least as a concept, the best combination of story, gameplay, meta-narrative, competition, and memes that you could hope to find in player characters. Destiny, both the original and the continuing sequel, have built a genuinely remarkable universe, all around an army of protagonists that should, in theory, be counter to any story. Why? I'll tell you why. Because when mankind first stepped foot onto Mars, they discovered the Traveler. Thankfully not the Genshin kind. And this Traveler is a terraforming extra-dimensional donut conduit for a life-giving power called the Light. The Traveler's origins branch back to before the universe, but my name is not Bife, so deep lore is not what I'm here for. Also, that would take like 9 hours. I'm not even kidding. So here's the Spark Notes. Before there was anything, there were these two cosmic somethings called the Gardener and the Winnower, and to drastically simplify what they were for the sake of time, they were forces of life/complexity and entropy/simplicity. They existed basically doing the same thing of the Gardener creating a simulated universe with life flourishing in various directions, and the Winnower uncreating that something for an innumerable amount of time, as every single simulation was overtaken by a single quote-unquote pattern. At least I think that's what was going on. The whole description of it is so esoteric that it'd make Dark Souls tell them to write more clearly. And in that state of before everything, they existed. Until the Gardener got bored doing the same thing over and over again and bet the Winnower that it would be extremely fun to play a new game. Called Destiny! Okay, no, but kind of. Because the initiation of this game saw the entire universe come into being, as the Gardener and the Winnower created for themselves new rules, got into a fight over it, and then created the universe in their fight as they split up. And also, all of this may not actually be true, or it could be a heavily biased retelling, since the info was given to us by the primary antagonist of the last 10 years of the story. So, take that as you will. However, what we do know is that the light and its counterpart, the darkness, which the winnower represented, are very real and very much their own, possibly self-aware entities that have been colliding over the ultimate fate of the multiverse, just as the story implies. The Traveler is deeply connected to the light and is an expression of the same fundamental principle the gardener as a metaphor is meant to represent, that being the desire for and ability to create complexity. And the means to do that is with something called paracausality, a term made up exclusively to refer to what happens when you flip physics the bird, as I feel most people would love to do. And well, that's the whole point of the light and darkness, although with two different philosophies behind them. Like I said, the light is complexity and material diversification, while darkness is entropy and a coalescence of simplicity or singularity. The simplest way I can explain it is being able to sidestep the normal laws of cause and effect. Say you want to light a match. Well, the match will need not only oxygen as fuel, but enough heat to light it. Paracausality says, screw that weak crap, look what I can do, even if you're in the vacuum of space. And that kind of stuff is exactly what the Traveler and the Traveler's darkness counterpart, the Veil, are pouring with. The Traveler is actually just the name humanity gave it, one of many given to the big golf ball in the sky, as it's been the guiding light to many more species than just humanity. What? Thought we were special? Nah, there's been dozens, if not hundreds of others before us, and some of them might have even gotten to use the fun stuff. But I get ahead of myself. First, the Traveler did what it always does. Terraforms planets to be thriving with life and generally seemed to make things pretty good for those around it. Human lifespan tripled, and technology the likes of which Elon Musk would froth at the mouth over began to be created. Things like autonomous nanotech that could build entire cities called Siva, or a defensive AI superweapon system run by a reverse Russian-speaking man-made machine god called Rasputin. Or the creation of the Exo, a race of mechanical humans who have the consciousness of human beings transplanted into them to become sapient, independently thinking people. And all that was just made by one family of crazy people. The Brays, specifically the patriarch and total nutcase that was Clovis Bray, had a hand in all of that, and arguably propelled humanity further towards the stars than almost anyone else. Just, don't ask how he managed to make some of these scientific marvels. It's not pretty. Despite all of that, most of the solar system was thriving, and to some degree there was even sense of unity among humanity under the Traveler. Some people began to see visions and hear the voice of the Traveler in their dreams, and humanity began to see it as more than just a helpful tool, but as something divine, or at least a great big friend. Not all of them, of course. Some, because humans are nothing if not rebellious children, decided to act like it was somehow their enemy. But still, it was a golden age. And as is the case with every golden age, it only gets called that posthumously. A swell of darkness, later known as the Black Fleet, came to the solar system to hunt the Traveler like so many times before. If you wondered why the Traveler isn't still with those aforementioned dozens, if not more species it uplifted, it's because of the Black Fleet and the forces it commands, such as the Hive, an insectoid race dedicated to the philosophy of the darkness called the Sword Logic, aka survival of the fittest to the extreme until only one perfect being remains, which is often called the final shape. The Black Fleet and the Hive swarmed the solar system in moments, rending all of humanity's wonders to nothing. Their colonies were lost, Siva was lost, and Rasputin failed to fend off the fleet and determined it was better to safeguard humanity as a whole, which meant firing off as many colony ships as possible into the vastness of space, just as humanity looked like it was following the exact same pattern as all the other races before them. When the Traveler should have done what it had always done before and traveled away, it instead fought back. In a pulse of light that crashed against the encroaching darkness, it disabled and sent away the Black Fleet, damaging itself in the exertion of power. And in the middle of that clash of light and dark was a colony ship that managed to avoid destruction. And what happened to them was very, very hard to explain. 'Cause caught between two paracausal forces of unparalleled magnitude, the ship and all people on board got uber-crushed into a singularity and shunted into a pocket universe where they were ground up, siphoned into pure potential energy, and reformed as the Awoken.
Another long story, but some of those awoken will later come out of the singularity and begin having a presence in the solar system. Due to other background situations that can be covered another day, as well as the Traveler's sacrifice, the Black Fleet was dispersed and made to leave the system while pockets of humanity continued to exist at various points in the solar system. Some crashed land on Neptune, yes, on Neptune, and managed to survive with advanced technology and using the Veil, which was suspiciously on Neptune and also sort of dormant. Some wound up on the planetoid of Nessus and were slowly picked off and killed by the presence of the Vex, which are time-traveling, universe-simulating microorganism piloting mechanical bodies in a multiversal mechanical hive mind network that is slowly trying to overcome both the light and dark in its efforts to calculate a future where there is only Vex, and is so inhospitable that it once almost outsoared logic to the god king of the hive. By the way, it's these chuckleheads that Clovis Bray was making contact with, and the darkness he was studying in order to create the Exos, which is hilariously not the worst thing he's done. And the rest of humanity were scattered to the winds across Earth, as the Traveler went quiet, but not before one last act of creation. The Traveler's final breath gave birth to the ghosts, and they were each filled with the compulsion to seek out those who had already died, passing on the light to their dry bones and letting them rise again with no memories of their past lives, as blank slates. These would be the Light-Bearers, and they are what each and every Guardian is. Though, to be clear, the term Guardian would not be used to define the Light-Bearers at first. In this era of displacement, the Dark Age, when all those enemies I mentioned before and more hounded the ruins of humanity's Golden Age, the Light-Bearers were not necessarily a beacon of hope for everyone. After all, if you woke up with no memories of your own and possessing cosmic powers in a world where no one could challenge you save for another of your kind, what kind of person would you become? A hero? A villain? Well, in this era, many would become warlords, constructing territories for themselves built on the light that flowed in their veins, channeled by their ghosts that, for the most part, cared more about their chosen than anything else. That light comes in 3 flavors, each of varying levels of making the laws of physics angry. Solar is, as it sounds, nuclear fire that can burn in the vacuum of space. I mentioned that before. Arc, my preferred light element, is harnessing raw energy in the form of electromagnetism on a cosmic level, and very likely the act of nuclear fission as well. In general, it represents the energies of life in the universe. It may manifest as bolts of lightning, but considering it can also be used to alter and distort space or enhance the physical body, don't mistake it for just electricity. And Void, which was once seen as bordering on darkness, is harnessing empty gaps and distortions in gravity and space-time that black holes, dark matter, and dark energy would fall into. This emptiness, like the vacuum of space, can be molded by the light when in the hands of a light-bearer, and often to the same kind of effects that black holes, dark matter, and dark energy would be able to create. Similarly, their powers manifest into 3 classes of light-bearers. The living, crayon-eating walls in both body and brains that are the Titans, who answer every question with a variable number of punches. The crackhead trailblazers that are the hunters, who know where every trap is but won't say where they are, because you need to get good. And the ones most likely to summon Cthulhu so they can study it and blame you when it goes poorly because you were standing 0.00001mm off mark. The Warlocks, aka my class. They're the warriors, the rogues, and the mages. That's the basics of it. Lightbearers aren't stuck with any one element, so they can shift from one to another, and unlike in the gameplay, more experienced ones can do this with 0 cooldown and 0 limits on their supers. If they want to, they could be dropping black holes every few seconds and giving the Earth multiple new suns. And that happened more than was good for the Lightless's comfort in the Dark Age, as these discordant Risen would turn a Mexican standoff into a mushroom cloud before the average human could blink. So, some Lightbearers with honor gathered together and decided that maybe making life terrible for what was practically their fellow man was a bad idea, and instead used their Deus Ex Machina powers to kill the warlords, hunting most of them down and ending them permanently. How would one do that? Well, there's a few obtuse ways to do it, but for a fellow Lightbearer, there's one simple plan. Grab a ghost and squeeze. Rule 1 of being a Lightbearer. The biggest threat to your existence is someone just like you. These Lightbearers, who defended humanity and began the slow act of bringing order to the world, were called the Iron Lords. These Iron Lords stuck to a grim but firm code of honor and chivalry, which guided humanity in their early ascent from the Dark Age, as human settlements began to be unified and protected by them and their Iron Wolves, and it all culminated with the founding of the city. Beneath the resting place of the traveler, what began as mere tents guided by one of the many speakers, who professed to speak for the traveler as some in the days before the collapse did, the Iron Lords began to erect walls and build homes. They defended against the vicious assaults of enemies like the Elixni, also called the Fallen, who are a race who once were uplifted by the traveler before it abandoned them like so many before. And even when all of that might was unified against the nascent city, the Iron Lords stood firm, as did Lightbearers who would take on the titles we know them by now. Guardians. Unified in the oath to protect humanity, the Traveler, and the last safe haven for both, Guardians rose up to be the indomitable heroes that you can play as now. Now, from here, I'm going to keep trying to be exact, but the timeline gets a little squiggy and hard to determine, so bear with me. The Iron Lords, having defended the city again and again, went looking for Siva in hopes of using it to rebuild rather than just protect what they had. However, Rasputin reawoke to weaponize Siva against them due to some hard-to-explain personal reasons. Siva infected their suits and turned Iron Lord on Iron Lord, only ending when they were sealed away and killed with explosives. With only one confirmed Iron Lord surviving, Lord Saladin Forge, the leading body behind the Guardians was gone. The Speaker did his best to create an answer to the void left behind by the Iron Lords and helped create the Vanguard, which is led basically exclusively by the Bald, with representatives of each class as their leaders who work to guide the Guardians in mankind's defense. However, some sources also suggest that the Vanguard was instead established sometime before the Iron Lord's final deaths, but this is my current assumption about the timeline. Again, my name is not Bife. Now, as you can guess, that led to some problems, such as that time a bunch of internal factions of the city alongside hired-out Guardians did a few civil wars and almost destroyed the city. This resulted in the creation of the Consensus, where the factions that didn't commit any atrocities were allowed to have representatives alongside the Vanguard leaders, all spearheaded by the Speaker. And now we're on to the actual game. And before you ask, yes, that was the short version. So this is what we're working with, huh? And let me tell you, despite all the highs and crushing lows of Destiny over the years, the Guardians are still the best. Hands down, without any hyperbole, you'd be hard-pressed to find a game like Destiny that makes its community-based main characters as good as Destiny makes the Guardians. Why? Because they're you. Every one of them is you and is treated like you. That includes all the stupid crap that you as a player get up to. Falling from high places and dying because it's funny? Canon. Threatening higher dimensional beings with the prospect of being turned into assault weaponry? Canon. Playing with a shiny purple ball in the HQ of the Vanguard while normal people are doing business? Canon. Killing the exact same batch of enemies over and over and even outright warping spacetime as they farm for the perfect weapon roll? Canon. Leaving in the middle of Crucible matches when your team is losing like a coward? Canon. The random dancing, especially on dead enemies? Canon. Heck, it's confirmed that the regular humans that work with the Guardians sometimes can't comprehend them as people because of their emoting. It's to the point that, canonically, alcohol is banned in the Vanguard HQ because drunken Guardians are infinitely more of a problem than sober ones. Which, that may sound like an obvious statement, but I'll remind you, paracausality. The Guardians all have the mindset of hundreds of thousands of gamers, and they are glorious. The head of the Crucible, a former warlord turned Guardian named Lord Shax, is so in love with combat and adores the Guardians that run his Crucible that he handed out special bows called the Vow as quote-unquote engagement presents because, in his own words, I will marry them all. This is the same guy who, as best we can tell, was summoned magically to recite a poem before the Queen of the Awoken, burned that book that had the poem and recited it from memory, then got freaky afterwards. Every true Destiny fan knows these words. The helmet stayed on. Todd Habercorn, the Drifter, runs a pseudo-legitimate game called Gambit that I don't know if anyone really plays anymore, where he outright encourages and laughs as you kill kidnapped enemies like the Fallen and each other. Add this kind of unseriousness to the diegetic respawn mechanic of the ghosts who revive you however many times you need, unless you're in a zone deemed too dangerous or too devoid of light for them to do so, and you might think that it'd make for an army of Mary Sues that you could never hope to get invested in. And while that can be played for fun, one-off action adventures like in, say, the Vanguard Strikes, or the Crucible, which is the PvP mode that is in-universe, televised to the city for everyone to watch and make bets on as you kill each other, all this could also be seen as a detriment to any serious story. Admittedly, there are times Destiny fumbles with telling a convincing or serious story with the weight it deserves. But how do they manage to pull it off correctly? One word. Scale. Because you being a self-regenerating demigod capable of bending physics over your knee doesn't make you a Mary Sue in this universe. Why? 1. There's a lot more of them than there are of you. 2. You're fighting to protect more than just yourself. And 3. It's not the Goombas that you fear. It's the Bowser that they serve. Destiny employs a logic that I truly adore. When everyone is overpowered, nobody is. You may be able to turn people to ashes with a light breeze and a cough, but Oryx, the Taken King and Godmaster of the Hive, could weaponize concepts and turn you inside out with darkness, and was only able to be permanently killed by using his own philosophy against him inside his personal pocket dimension before choosing not to succumb to said philosophy. A warlock can reach into your mind and make your brain melt, but Dominus Gaul, military leader of an interstellar empire called the Cabal, just swooped in and trapped the traveler in a giant bondage cage and cut off your light. Deal with that, loser. This level of escalation, amplifying the levels of conflict to points that even the maddening power of the average Guardian feels small in comparison, allows you to play out the power fantasy of being the ultimate cosmic horror of a superhero that a Guardian can be, while also allowing you to feel the stakes of the story when needed. The biggest, heaviest moments of the story comes when that veneer of indomitability is worn away. Like before, during the Red War when Gaul takes the light and takes over the city, rendering the legendary Guardians as little more than very experienced soldiers. Or during Forsaken, when the beloved hero in Hunter Vanguard, Cade Six, made his final stand and had his ghost destroyed, ensuring his final death. Stories abound of Guardians being ripped from the timeline by higher order Vex and erased entirely. Or Guardians who go insane, or hunt down ghosts, or are never revived by their ghost due to suffering intense delusions of grandeur. We as Guardians are allowed to feel almost hysterically powerful at times, because that makes the reminder that we aren't all the more gripping. We've also been reminded that those who wield the light are not always our allies, that we too can wield the darkness as weapons. While I may have my issues with how Destiny 2 has portrayed the idea of darkness and light, especially with the ever overplayed story beat of them just being tools or complementary, even though the darkness has clearly been shown to actively corrupt people in the darkness, or rather the Winnower's end goal is the destruction of all life, I can't argue against the fact that their inclusion in the hands of our enemies and our attempts to wield the, as of writing this, two forms of darkness has added spice to what could have been a stale power dynamic. These forms, by the way, are Stasis and Strand. Stasis is the embodiment of heat death, a ceasing of energy and movement, and thus it manifests as ice, whereas Strand is latent psychic energy made into physical form, like weaponizing the idea of the collective unconsciousness. And in the final shape, we gain the ability to mix and match these powers as chromatic Guardians. From a gameplay perspective, all this keeps the powers of the Guardians fresh and diverse, to the point that you can confidently say no two Guardians are necessarily going to be running the same build. Sure, the meta still exists, but it's never something you have to do. I beat the legendary campaigns of Witch Queen, Lightfall, and Final Shape solo, all just using a witherboard and whatever nonsense I came up with at the time. And by implicitly making these sorts of things canon to the game, it adds a sense of real community choice to Destiny 2 that could be missing in other similar scenarios, where your actions aren't treated with as much consideration. It also gives the world extra character that such silly, meaningless things happen in the same world where horrors beyond imagination can be brought down in defense of the things important to us by the people doing those silly, meaningless things. And if that wasn't enough, you get to see the world you'd be protecting alongside your own ghost. The relationship between a ghost and their guardian can speak volumes of the guardian in question, but for our slow-to-speak protagonist, our ghost is the perfect little buddy that just loves to yap. Ghost, as our constant companion and voice, could come across as a glorified exposition device, and, well, that's because he is. But he's also a plot device. In a good way. He serves to give voice to certain ideas that the game designers would want you to think about. The morality and safety of using darkness, the corrupting nature of revenge, faith in the traveler, the ghost through it all serves as a mirror to the themes of the story. And it rarely feels shoehorned since he's always been here serving as the voice for himself and you. But he's not the only person who can serve to invest you to care for this world, and to make you want to save it as the guardians you are. Zavala, Vanguard Commander and Titan Vanguard, the stoic father figure everyone needs in their life that is objectively correct 99% of the time, and who was, until the final shape, voiced by the legend that was Lance Reddick. Rest in peace, Commander. We have the Warlock Vanguard, Ikora Rey, who has some very enthusiastic fans, and is renowned for pretty much obliterating everyone in Crucible to the point that she's not allowed to participate beyond just because she's a Vanguard. We have Shaxx and Drifter, as mentioned before, the new Empress of the Cabal, Keitel, who has allied herself with humanity after we obliterated her boyfriend and dad. Luckily, she doesn't seem too broken up about it. Also, she's super into Zavala, I'm just saying. And she is learning how to knit from Saladin, which is just... do I need to say why that's incredible? Naturally, we have my favorite character in all of Destiny, Mithrax, Kell of House Light. Lesser people call him Mithrax. And leader of the Elixni that have opted to ally with humanity in recent years, as opposed to trying to constantly steal the Traveler back. He's a whole other can of worms to discuss, however. This video is dedicated to the Guardians and humanity specifically, and it's dragging for a bit. So let's wrap up. My thesis is this. The Guardians are the perfect protagonists, not just because they're fun to control for the basic gameplay, but also because how they serve a role as both a self-insert and collectively as their own characters. This isn't Fire Emblem, where your self-insert has the personality of a bread sandwich, and we aren't just playing a character totally independent of us that we just have to watch. You know, like Fire Emblem. We are, each and every one of us, in the game, even if the Guardian we play as moves on their own and may even talk every once in a while. They are a Swiss Army knife of a concept that, if nothing else, Bungie has managed to make work when most similar attempts failed miserably. Because they're allowed to have some fun with it. To not get bogged down in too much seriousness while genuinely appreciating what the players give to the game in the form of community culture. Many of those ridiculous lore bits that are canon would not have been made canon if the players didn't do those things. Inside jokes wouldn't have been voiced by the actual voice actors if the people behind the scenes didn't really care. There wouldn't be so much emphasis on community-driven events like raid races if the ones who put their blood, sweat, and tears into making the product didn't care. For those who know Destiny too well, I think we can all agree on one thing at least. If they want this to keep going, all they have to do is fire the Bungie executives. That's right, this was a backdoor takedown of Bungie's higher-ups. Listen here, Pete. I've got some friendly advice. Sell the crappy cars, pay your Traveler-forsaken employees, don't let the story ground to a halt whenever you're riding high, and only let the writers cook whenever your bottom line is about to be limbo dancing in hell. Because if you don't, well, you'll be hearing the angry cries of people who actually care about the game you oversee for a very long time. And unlike you, we have all the power in the world. You market to us because you want our money. If you fail to market to us, you say goodbye to the fan base that lets you live the lifestyle you're so comfortable with. Your move, Pete. Hey boys, I heard you like bugs. Well, we sure got bugs. Tall bugs, flying bugs, heavy bugs, wormy bugs, and a bug that makes people feel some sort of way, because the internet is horrible. But most importantly, these bugs have an empire older than memory that has been slowly genociding world after world in a ritualistic crusade so that when the end of all things comes, one of them can rise above all others to be the perfected final uber bug and stand as the pinnacle of existence. And guess what? They've already killed billions of you. Look out into the heavens and ask yourself, what do you imagine is out there? Distant worlds we may one day call our own? Other people with histories as long as ours? A great, beautiful nothing? Well, too bad, because what you get are space bugs that hate you personally. And while these bipedal crustaceans may look like cannon fodder, they've already smoked 99% of what they've come across, and you're the last 1%. They have endless hordes, magic they've created that borders on paracausal, can mold an extra-dimensional plane so that the strongest of their kind may never truly die, and at their height they command the very concepts of war, trickery, and domination. Say hello to the Hive, the end of a million species. And let me say hello. I am the Hearth Guy, and if you aren't familiar with Destiny or have not seen my first video covering it, then I'd suggest you do that, because I'm going to be jumping off a lot of what was pre-established in that video for this one. In terms of enemy types in Destiny, the Hive are by far the most reoccurring foe we've seen the last 10 years. Having been the main antagonists of 5 expansions in the last, half of the seasons, they've been present and ruining everyone's day in pretty much every single part of the story, even parts where they're not the main focus. In the past, they've been the most hated enemy Guardians have ever had, and who have given them some of the most painful defeats. In fact, whereas the Cabal or the Vex may each have 1 or 2 moments of instilling real terror into humanity, the Hive have horrified them since they were first aware of them in the early City Age, such that a truly dark and all-encompassing saying was formed to give clear warning of their evils. Moon's haunted. But I'm jumping ahead a bit. Best to start at the beginning, or at least a beginning. On the gas giant of Fundament far, far away from Earth, a race of enormous serpentine worm things dwelled in the hydrogen and helium seas of the planet's layered atmospheres. Though their official name was never stated, they lived blessed with some level of paracausality and were pretty chill generally. That was until a darkness from beyond the stars called to them, as one does, tempting them towards a philosophy they would call the Sword Logic, a way of life and spirituality, believe it or not, defined by the final nature of darkness. That all life is to suffer, and therefore, to earn one's right to exist, they must be strong enough to keep themselves alive and deny life to others. Because if something isn't strong enough to defend its own existence, then its existence is unnecessary and worthless. Cheery. This will naturally lead to a desired outcome where only one being remains in all of existence, one that has destroyed all that is unnecessary, which they understand to be the final shape. The creatures of Fundament took on this philosophy with open arms and began slaughtering each other to the point that they genocided themselves, until only a handful remained, 5 of which had become steeped in paracausal energies and became remade as what would be called worm gods, before being imprisoned in Fundament's core by the Leviathan, a gargantuan creature of the light and servant to the Traveler, which was at the time serving as patron to the Ammonites, which were a spacefaring civilization that called the 52 moons of Fundament their home. Luckily for them, and unluckily for pretty much everybody else that existed, they'd encounter Rulk later on, a being of darkness that promised their freedom if the mother of the remaining worms, Zeta, came to serve him and his master's Black Fleet. She agreed, and so the fate of the worm gods became tied to the Black Fleet. Technically, whether they fell to the Sword Logic before or after they encountered Rulk is sort of hard to tell, as lore can get a bit fuzzy on the details. However, this is the turn of events that makes sense to me. Now, as time passed, these creatures weren't the only ones on Fundament to be drawn to the dark. Also on Fundament were a tiny, weak, ill-fated race that lived pitiful, stupid lives on the wreckage of their homeworld that had crashed into the planet's helium sea. These were the Krill, who regularly could barely reach 10 Fundament years before dying. That's not even counting all the other ways they could be killed. Acid rain, disintegrating lightning storms, toxic oceans, cloud-like animals that lured them to their deaths. They pretty much woke up on their first day and received the objective to survive. And most of them failed. In one small stretch of civilization, there was the Osmium Court, ruled by the Osmium King, who at the ripe old age of 10 grew mad from the knowledge of something called the Syzygy, or God Wave, a supposed tidal event where the 52 moons of Fundament would align and cause the seas of Fundament to destroy all life, including the Krill. And to all this nonsense, another Krill named Taux would take exception. Taux was an infertile mother and served as teacher to the 3 daughters of the Osmium King, Shiro, Sathona, and Arash. Taux plotted against the king and his daughters, thinking they were too weak to rule, and invited an enemy nation called the Helium Drinkers to take power and make her regent. And if the Helium Drinkers did not canonically have the most high-pitched voices, then I'm going to be very disappointed in the lore department. Shiro, Sathona, and Arash fled from their home as their father was killed, and Sathona took his familiar, an ancient worm filled with secrets, and they sailed off onto the Fundament Sea. Though Arash thought all hope was lost and Shiro could do little to comfort her, Sathona, as always as it would turn out, had a plan for them. She could hear a voice coming from the worm which warned them of the God Wave and how to prevent it. This led them to an old ship designed to pierce the layers of Fundament and break down to its depths. Shiro was hesitant to go along with this as it could kill them in the process, but Arash and Sathona urged her on for 2 different reasons. Sathona knew there was something to find because she could hear the worm, and Arash was fiercely determined to get her home back and fiercely curious, so they went deeper and deeper. falling to the inner fathoms of Fundament where they crossed paths with the Leviathan, who made the choice pretty clear to them about what would happen next if they proceeded. They were entering the deep, realm of darkness. The sky, or the light, was the path to civilization, peace, and hope. But the Leviathan offered no solution to the God Wave, and when Sathona revealed the worm's presence, her sisters followed her advice and continued, where they finally met the Great Worms. In exchange for eternal life and incredible power, they asked only that they take the larvae of the worms as parasites, which would empower the transformation. The rules of the deal were simple. Feed the worms with actions reinforcing their current natures, that being Shiro's desire to grow stronger, Sathona's cunning, and Orash's curiosity, all of which basically just boiled down to killing people. But, as they grew stronger, the appetite of the worms would grow stronger as well, and if they ever stopped feeding them, then the worms would devour them instead. Sword logic made manifest. Agreeing, each took upon themselves a different morph, which shaped them for a new purpose. Shiro took on the Night Morph as Shivu Arath, god of war. Sathona took on the Mother Morph as her role as Savathun, the Witch Queen. And Orash took on the King Morph, which changed her, reshaping Orash into the male Oryx, at least I assume that's how that's pronounced, to become king of a new race, the Hive. The preceding years would see the same pacts spread through the Krill as the siblings returned to the Osmium court, slaughtered their enemies, and made Taux flee from Fundament. Any Krill who refused the worms were killed, and Aurix turned his eyes to his next target, the Ammonites, who sheltered Taux. Initially, Aurix attempted to negotiate with them, but Savathun heard the words of the worms and killed her brother instead. But he did not truly die. Instead, as per his new nature, Aurix was swept into what is called the Ascendant Realm, an interdimensional plane of energy heavily tied to the darkness, and is a place where ideas and willpower can shape existence, where those who master the precepts of the sword logic can forge throne worlds to call their own, personal pocket dimensions that obey the rules the creator sets in place. If you know Warhammer, think of it like a dark-flavored warp. The only difference is there's no chaos gods calling the shots, it's just whoever can impose their will hardest. When a hive, or really anyone who follows the sword logic, collects enough death and empowers themselves with darkness enough, they become Ascendant and can enter the Ascendant realm upon death or manually. If someone contains a throne world, they can just keep returning to it over and over and over when they die, and can only really be killed if killed inside their own throne world, which, since whoever enters it has to obey their rules, can clearly be a tough thing to pull off. Realizing the intrinsic value of the Ascendant Plane, Aurix returned having heeded the words of Savathun and the worms, expelling all compassion and sentiments for peace, and giving himself fully to the conquest. What followed was the execution of the Ammonites, the flight of the Traveler, sacrifice of the Leviathan, and the beginnings of an eons-old war of domination across the stars. While they started off just chasing Taux, they began getting more and more into the mass genocide angle and got creative, shaping their own throne worlds. Aurix made High War, Savathun made the High Coven, and Sivu Arath made the Black Terrace. And the three would regularly do war with each other and kill one another to grow stronger as per the tenets of the sword logic, ever sharpening each other on their blades. And for tens of thousands of years, their war of genocide washed through the universe. Until they encountered their greatest challenge by that point. The Ecumen. Again, I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that right. They get fancy with these names. The Ecumen were a spacefaring civilization of many client races united in culture and technology and using the darkness evidently as a means to communicate. Their power was such that they commanded entire sections of their home galaxy. And while the Hive was successful in annihilating some of their planets early on, they became stalled as the Ecumen gave more of their resources to the fight. Specifically in targeting the sibling Hive gods, repeatedly killing them enough times, Aurix didn't even bother stepping outside his throne world without an entire army to defend himself. What was worse was that they were beginning to realize the trick played on them by the worm gods. They had grown strong, yes, but their worms' appetites had grown stronger. Stronger than they could ever hope to feed them on their own. And their advance and armies stalled, being churned away towards extinction. With few options, the siblings gathered in High War to make a plan. Sivu Arath wanted to retreat to regroup, Savathun wanted to get the worm gods to help them, but Aurix had a different idea. A better idea. He would claim greater power by bringing true death, in large quotation marks, to his sisters, which would grant him enough power to challenge the greatest of the worm gods, Akka, Worm of Secrets. The power of 3 hive gods behind him, he killed Akka and took his secrets, and went to commune with the deep itself. From the heart of the darkness, he learned the power to take, to subsume a creature in darkness, effectively turn them inside out, and rebuild them as a willless paracausal zombie that serves their master. When he had returned, he had been changed once again. He was no longer Aurix, he was Oryx, the Taken King. For the next 100 years, Oryx changed armies of the Ecumen into Taken, and through war he would resurrect Xivu Arath, and through trickery he would resurrect Savathun. So as their worlds were destroyed, the Ecumen fled into the void between galaxies. But after 1,000 years of hunt, they were ultimately erased by the Hive for good. During this same campaign, Oryx and his sisters came up with a solution to the hunger of the worms. They would create a hierarchical string of ties between the lowest thrall to the gods themselves. Each act of war, trickery, domination, and violence would feed enough for the Hive in question, and the rest would be given to their superior. A species-wide chain that keep the gods eternally fed. After all this, and after a few more genocides, Oryx considered that perhaps he was a douchebag. Not really, no. What he did consider was that he was perhaps a nihilist, one who created nothing and only broke, and after he communed with the deep and got stuck there because his sisters cut off his ties to kill him, he pondered on his sisters. To the Hive at this point, love and hate, life and death were intertwined, so to love another was to kill them, to sharpen them and yourself. If you didn't kill them brutally and try and make sure that they never came back, did you really care about them in the first place? One of Oryx's brightest memories of his sister, Xivu Arath, was of her blowing up a moon with both of them on it as he was killing her, because it was a moment that strengthened them both. This led to him deciding that he needed children, and the first of them would be called Crota, the Eater of Hope. There was also Nokris, but he was a whiny baby that became a necromancer, which is heresy to the Hive, because it revives rightfully slain creatures, so he was banished and had his name stripped. Surely he won't come back. He also had 2 daughters, Ir Anuk and Ir Halak, who come to be the creators of the concept of an oversoul, which is basically what happens when you separate the idea of your death from yourself inside a throne world, making you harder to kill. Obviously. Crota, trying to get some of that power for himself, tried to make a wound in his father's throne world because Savathun told him to. What he did instead was make the Vex come out of absolutely nowhere and start causing a problem inside the Ascendant Plane. When, after some trial and error, they made a Vex mine called Quoria, to simulate the sword logic and start to out-sword logic the Hive inside the actual Hive God's throne world. Savathun, the classy aunt that she is having a laughing fit while Oryx was away, requiring one of the worm gods themselves to tell him to get back with the Vex milk and death totems and clean up his house. Luckily, he commands paracausality, which the Vex, that can only simulate life off the laws of physics, hate as much as a cold, emotionless machine could hate anything. Oryx then grabbed Crota by the leg and tossed him kicking and screaming into the Vex network for being an idiot and told him not to come back until he killed some things. Considering the adaptive but rigid minds of the Vex and the near catastrophe in his own throne world, Oryx decided he had to shake things up. So he used Akka's flesh and created a massive flagship to amplify his power, the Dreadnought, and turned his throne world inside out, merging it into the Dreadnought. He then stole Quoria because he thought the Vex simulating the sword logic was funny and gave it to Savathun because he thought she'd like it. What a loving brother. Then he promptly murdered another civilization called the Harmony before they all split up to seek their own ways of doing things. Xivu Arath decided to seek out simple war without all the complicated nonsense Oryx was up to. Oryx continued his conquest, annihilating more species that the Traveler blessed, including the Elixni, also called the Fallen, and Savathun schemed, as she always did, for she had grown dissatisfied with the way things were, with the tributes, with the worm she had to feed. And while her original plans to use gravity and warping space-time to feed up the tribute rate failed, she was able to circumvent it a bit by introducing the concept of Imbaru, a reimagining of the sword logic with trickery rather than just outright violence. To be deceived and failing to see that deception would feed her worm just as death could. And with her being the god of cunning, this improved the rate of her feeding. She separated from her siblings and sent her brood into a black hole to be away from her brother's prying eyes. And there she used Quoria, after teaching it Hive magic, how to simulate and alter the singularity of the black hole for herself. And in all this, Savathun came face to face with the voice that had truly been steering them all the way before. The master of the worm gods and even of Rolk. The voice in the darkness, or as we would know it, the Witness. Savathun swore allegiance to it, but Rolk was placed in the High Coven to ensure her loyalty, and it seems another test was put in place, because the Black Fleet had cornered the Traveler again, above a planet called Earth, and it sent Savathun there. If you watched my first video or have any awareness of Destiny, you likely know the story of humanity by now and their collapse, but Savathun was there, at the collapse, with her brood and stationed in the moon. Yes, I said that right, in the moon. And the Black Fleet alongside another disciple of the Witness called Nezarec, who could steal into the fears and dreams of mortals and make them real. They sought out and secured the Veil, the darkness counterpart of the Traveler, and would have returned it to the Witness, if Savathun had not played very close to the chest. She betrayed Nezarec, cursed his remains, and hid the Veil from even the Witness, such that no betrayal was suspected. And as the collapse ended with the Traveler's sacrifice, Savathun hid in the shadows and watched, waiting. She tugged at strings here and there, and the Witness, believing the Veil to be gone, left the system in search for it. Others were also close behind the collapse, as Nokris showed up with Zol, the weakest of the worm gods, which had taught him necromancy, to try and take the planet of Mars. But these utter losers and total failures got beat up by Rasputin and then flash frozen for the next unknown eon, which officially brings us to the beginning of Destiny's story. From here, at least, during the Dark Age, the Hive would be inactive in Earth's moon, led by a figure from their history. Crota. See, Crota had effectively been doom-guying it up inside the Vex network, being shoved around space-time, becoming a nightmare to various cultures across time and space because of it, all while learning the sword logic for himself and crafting his own brood. Somewhere he got access to the Ascendant Plane again and began doing whatever he felt like, including hanging out inside the moon. In the early City Age, Crota sends his Hive to attack humanity, and though they were pushed back at the Battle of the Burning Lake, they'd have the last laugh, because the Guardians of the City underestimated the Hive and Crota's power. So when they went thousands strong against them on the moon, what came next would forever be known as the Great Disaster. The Guardians couldn't comprehend the sword logic, nor understand how Crota and his Hive's ascendant swords could eat their light. It was a massacre, as the crust of the moon was split by the swings of Crota's blade. An entire generation's worth of Guardians were lost, forever changing the way Guardians fought and acted. And it could have been so much worse. Crota hadn't planned on stopping. In fact, it was coincidence that saved humanity that day, as one of his highest-ranked subordinates was killed in a dispute with one of Xivu Arath's subordinates, depriving Crota of a hefty chunk of his tithe and power. So instead, he slumbered on the moon, and the moon would become forbidden for all but the most elite Guardians or the most important missions. And even then, that can end in disaster, as shown with Eris Morn's fire team that went in to kill Crota only to be picked off one by one, leaving Eris to claw her way back to the surface after years of being lightless. Hence the ancient words, "Moon's haunted." Also, the words like, comment, and subscribe for more. No, never mind. I can't do it. How do people shield themselves in the middle of a video? Anyway, now we're at the beginning of Destiny's story. So much more happened for the Hive over the last 10 years, but needless to say, they have a history and character that makes it impossible to forget. Where the Flood of Halo or the Tyranids of Warhammer are these waves of mindless assimilators, the Hive share their aesthetic, but beyond that are diametrically different. They don't seek to assimilate anything, but to erase all that isn't themselves. They're not a hive mind despite the name, for that'd defeat the purpose of the sword logic, where each individual life must justify its own existence on its own, for anything given is a sign of weakness. They are also the only race at the start of Destiny's story to still be an existential threat to humanity from the get-go. The Fallen are in disarray, the Cabal's best moments are yet to come, and the Vex's plans are impossible to comprehend, and rarely do they attack the city directly. The Hive, meanwhile, are still active and, by the start of the first Destiny, yet to be truly cowed by the Vanguard. Not until the first expansion, The Dark Below, where you stop Crota's awakening and kill his soul inside his throne world, does the Hive get any real obstacle to their conquest from the Guardians themselves. Then Oryx shows up to avenge Crota as per his pact and the laws of tribute, and pretty much wipes out the Awoken until halfway through Destiny 2, almost 4 or 5 years later. You then have to, bit by bit, break apart his Taken and find a way to his inner sanctum to fight him and kill him in the flesh, before you kill him for good in the raid where the Guardian's own light has to obey the sword logic. But even then, the Taken King is no match for 6 hyped-up gamers with rocket launchers, and he gets thrown from the orbit of Saturn and crash lands somewhere on the moon of Titan. And because the Guardians refused to keep following the sword logic after his death, his throne as Taken King went unclaimed, making Oryx's spirit truly banished. Even in death, though, his presence shapes the story, as his empty throne becomes a major plot point even now. And without his presence, the many things he's taken and is taken in general become a wild card in the hands of several major villains. Forsaken, the expansion everyone loves, would not have been possible without Oryx taking Riven, the last Ahamkara, and planting the seeds for Savathun to use that for her own gain, taking the dreaming city of the Awoken. This is part of what makes the Hive so great and important to Destiny, because every time they and their gods do something, it shakes the universe. Like I mentioned in the first video, scale is the secret ingredient here, and the Hive almost always delivers. They've had a few weaker moments, but even at their worst, their lore leaves a lot to use. Warmind's story saw Nokris and Zol reawaken to cause problems and get obliterated again, but I don't know if I'd call their story bad, just simple, and any reference to Oryx remains a highlight. Not to mention, we got Whisper of the Worm out of it. And once Savathun did take the Dreaming City by Riven's power and the Guardians fulfilling a part of the ritual to do so, the Hive again became a problem in Shadowkeep, as Nezarek's power and the Witness's influence began seeping into the solar system. And how could anyone forget the Witch Queen expansion? After a year of buildup of Savathun scheming to escape her worm and the Witness, of running from Xivu Arath and even hiding in the form of one of our allies, Osiris, she tricks the Queen of the Awoken into removing her worm so she can make her final gambit. A plea to the Traveler. Bowing her head to the being she chased for eons, the Witch Queen dies, and is revived by a ghost. The weight of the Hive gaining the light, becoming real Guardians, is so palpable it's still hard to grasp even 2 years later. Not only did it shake up the gameplay in wildly creative ways, it threw into question everything we knew about how the light worked, how the Traveler worked, and made Savathun into an even greater presence than Oryx was. And even more dynamic of a character, frankly. For the woman who brought the sword logic to the Hive, her fate is now tied with us, the Guardians, as we investigate how she got the light, and we use mementos for her past to see her memories, hoping to find clues, totally unaware that she'd been watching this all. After all, a Guardian, Hive or human, has no memory of their past life, until we show Savathun all of hers. It's honestly impressive the fact that not only does the Guardian, but also we the player get tricked by Savathun, and by extension the writers. There's a saying about how smart characters are only as smart as the people who write them, which convinces me beyond a shadow of a doubt that the people who wrote Lightfall and Witch Queen are not the same. Because then they dropped the biggest bombshell involving the Hive yet, that they never should have even gotten to this point. There was no God Wave. There was no syzygy, at least not originally. That's why the Leviathan offered no solution to it, because it had no reason to believe it was real. All of it was a lie whispered by the worm that led them this far, from the voice in the darkness. Why? To prevent the Traveler's light, high above, from reaching them. What irony that after chasing it all this time, trying to kill it, the Traveler had been wanting just one of the Hive, no, the Krill, to reach back to it. And Savathun did, defying the sword logic, defying the Witness, and making her sister very, very mad. Xivu Arath's presence in the story did not begin until Season of the Hunt, around the time she began chasing Savathun, and her Wrathborn, which are various races enthralled into this mindset of bloody violence, started sweeping through the solar system. And surprisingly enough, for a god of war, she's remained in the background. From a story perspective, that makes sense. As God of War, she gets stronger in battle, so having the Guardians fight her directly would probably not be a good idea, or at the very least would end in a stalemate, which is just another application of the Hive and their unique rules. Every time we've beaten Xivu Arath, we've had to circumvent her. We've had to be clever, whether that's killing one of her highest-ranked subordinates, denying her the power of an act of war that would have given her the ability to just appear on Earth, or denying her access to the last proto-worm that she's trying to kill. Few enemy factions in Destiny can play on the same level as your average Guardian, toying with cause and effect, weaponizing ideas, and defying death so easily. There's even something to be said for a parallel between how the Hive treat death and the Guardians do. Let's be honest, we are some aggressive loot gremlins, killing hordes of enemies as we try to get the strongest weapons, the coolest armor, or even better abilities. In terms of the sword logic, we're experts by now. Just look at the Crucible. A blood sport of Guardians throwing themselves at one another to show off their strength and become stronger. And while that has been attempted to be used as a gotcha to the Guardians so they'll succumb to the sword logic, instead the Guardians do what they always do, weaponize it when they need to and drop it when they don't. Unlike the Hive, especially Xivu or Wrath, they only play by those rules when they have to because they understand what it means to be paracausal, to define your own fate, and to get yourself killed in humorous fashion. This, along with other things, adds a surprising amount of, for lack of a better word, humanity in the Hive. The siblings love each other a lot, it's just that by this point their concept of love requires they make each other better through violence, trickery, and conquest. Xivu or Wrath becomes an emotional mess by the time we first hear her speak after Oryx's death and Savathun's betrayal. That grief is then weaponized against us thrice. First when she tries to instigate Rasputin's weapons to be fired, creating an act of war which would have empowered her. Again while she hunts the last of the proto-worms, as I mentioned before, Asa, and once more as she searches for a way to get at Savathun's, at the time, corpse, as she contends with Eris Morn, who uses her knowledge of Hive magic to become a Hive god herself, the Hive god of vengeance. Before the final shape, which is as far as I'll cover, Xivu or Wrath's story ended with Eris Morn and Savathun making a deal, which ultimately led to Yu tithing power to Eris until she was strong enough to claim Savathun's own power through killing her in her throne world. This, temporarily, made Eris Morn the most powerful Hive god and allowed her to banish Xivu or Wrath from her own throne world, stealing her immortality and kneecapping her ability to fight. Again and again, the sword logic is mastered better by the Guardians than the Hive, all while the Guardians actively don't care one whit about it. Oryx is left dead or in a limbo state, Xivu or Wrath is weakened, and Savathun was surprised even by the Guardians when they revealed the witness's treachery to her. In many ways, the Hive, for as powerful and destructive as they've been, are failures. And that's what makes them interesting. Because despite all this talk of the sword logic, that only that which proves its existence may survive, Oryx still committed the acts of creation, for he did not want to be a simple nihilist. It's a contradiction. Heck, the Hive's own tithing system is somewhat antithetical to their philosophy, as the tithes have to be given rather than actively taken, so the Hive couldn't even keep to the sword logic way back then either. But, of course, the sword logic is never the be-all, end-all. No, it was a mere shadow of the truth, a shadow of the winnowing that the voice in the darkness had really sought, a shadow that the Hive never fully realized they were trapped in. Until Savathun. Savathun saw the lie, at least part of it. She didn't realize she'd been tricked about the God Wave, but she did see the fly in the ointment, as it were, and sought another way out. Oryx, however, for all his curiosity and desire to know more, was trapped in his own philosophy, unable to imagine a life beyond it. And Xivu or Wrath is now listless. No witness to guide her, no immortality or godhood to fall back on, and her own philosophy that she gave her eons-old existence to used against her. In the end, the only ones who came out winning were the Guardians and Savathun. Like I said, the Hives are failures in their own way of life, only kept afloat because their leaders kept finding new ways to make the sword logic work for them, rather than the other way around. Whether it was using the Ascendant Realm, tithing, taking, Mbaru, or more, the Hive were in an existential arms race with itself, and they finally came across an enemy that adapted faster than they did. And what has to be the most infuriating part for them is that it came from people who work in total contradictions to it. The Guardians die and respawn as many times as they want, rarely facing true death. They work together for a united sense of peace. They destroy where they have to, but reach out to those they can and gather underneath the promise of the Traveler, of the light, peace, and civilization. The peace and civilization that the Sisters had rejected all those years ago on Fundament. No matter how you slice it, unless imposed on them, the final shape the Hive wanted could never come from the Guardians, and the Hive can't reach their final shape because the Guardians are better at it than them. No wonder Xivu or Wrath has been crashing out almost every time she interacts with us. And no wonder Savathun realized the only way to beat the Guardians was to become one. In any other setting, the Hive would be an apocalypse no one could overcome. But in Destiny, they are faced with their natural counterpart and the answer to all they've created. And that answer is that they were always wrong. That's what makes them great. because this end times horde, older than we could fathom, is no less fallible than any of us, no less personable, and no less capable of atrocities. And even now, there's some humanity. Look at my personal favorite hive, Luzaku, a hive guardian that genuinely wants to serve the traveler, who genuinely wants to help the guardians. She is a complete about-face from what a normal hive acts like, and yet she makes complete sense to what a hive guardian would naturally become. She, along with Savathun to a degree, are what the traveler always wanted the Krill to be. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a math calculator got a physical body that was composed of electric milk and then made a hive mind big enough to eat the universe, but was constantly stopped by actual crazy people using powers that don't make sense at all while they're still trying to take over the world with math? It must suck to be a Vex.
I am about to say something very stupid. Time travel. Yeah, time travel as a concept, though very interesting, rarely gets done well. Not only does it often make a story more complicated than it has to be, but it's also regularly been used as a deus ex machina whenever the story's been written into a corner. A cheap way to force tension back into the story where there is none, or solve a problem written to be impossible to solve. And yet, Destiny has somehow managed to make an entire species of robots that use the space-time continuum as their jump rope be regular-level enemies that almost never get anything they want done without someone else's input. Hello, Guardians. I am the Hearth Guy, and these are the Vex. One of the many cosmic horrors that are out for blood, but unlike most others, they have far grander ambitions than just this one stretch of the stars. What you may mistake at first for simple machine drones, the Vex are in fact a quantum swarm intelligence composed of countless components, which each embody every single Vex construct through the shared energy liquid that makes up their processing cores, radiolaria. Radiolaria is a collective substance of silica-based lifeforms which, when together and in tandem, compose the Vex superconsciousness. This radiolaria originates from beyond the birth of the universe, at least according to the Unveiling lore book, told to us by the Witness, which is the oldest entity we have interacted with regularly, barring a couple implied interactions with the Darkness and definite interactions with the Traveler. According to Unveiling, the Vex came to be from the Flower game that the Winnower and Gardener, the primordial names and/or origins of darkness and light, played. This Flower game was simulations upon simulations of universes, detailing civilizations rising and falling, the shifting of one dominant species to the next, and in each and every simulation it always ended the same, consumed by a single constant pattern. This pattern was the Vex, and they were pleasing to the Darkness. However, the Light, or rather the Gardener, was bored by the endless repetition. I've recounted this story before in my first Destiny video, so I'll be brief, but the disagreement between Gardener and Winnower led to the creation of new sets of rules and new forces, the paracausal forces of light and dark themselves as we understand them. While it's a whole debate whether the energies and the entities are one and the same, that's not important to this video. What's important is what became of those patterns within the Flower game. Because as the real universe was born from the conflict of light and dark, the early heat of the universe nurtured the patterns left behind from the game. These patterns, existing as raw energy, fell upon the first hot planets of the universe and became briny seas of radiolaria. It's largely supposition, but it seems the Vex were quick to establish a hive mind of sorts, where the unified Vex intelligence used the microscopic organisms of radiolaria as an extension of its will, enabling early advances in technology and understanding of the universe's makeup. To the point that before almost any other civilization or creatures in the universe, the Vex had already begun making super constructs, such as ones that expanded the lifespans of their hypermassive stars that they called home, and had begun to form as the kind of Vex we recognize. Metallic drones housing pods of radiolaria as their central processing units. The Vex intelligence was able to do so not only because of its unified properties, but because the Vex themselves don't think like you or I do. Whether by nature or because of their swarm intelligence, Vex don't follow a clear step-by-step process of action and reaction as we humans might. When we want to solve a problem, we might experience internally the steps to go about solving it, hypothesis, experiment, etc. But by then, a Vex has already acted upon the solution. What's more, they're likely to use the nature of the problem to correct itself, such as using the energy a fire produces to put the fire out.
Whether the individual Vex knows why that solution works is irrelevant, as long as the data that the solution does work is preserved and propagated across more Vex units. This is because the Vex simulate everything, long before they reach the point of action. Within the Vex mind, reality and simulation are one and the same, as they all can follow predictable patterns. Like I said before, the Vex were the all-consuming pattern across countless simulated realities in the Flower game, and so they too can simulate endless realities to determine endless solutions to endless problems. And if there's a problem outside the scope of normalcy, they can still adapt rapidly and experiment with that new problem to find every possible reaction. Why? Not because they want to, but because they must. They are the final pattern of the Flower game, and to them, they must make the reality they live in match up with their simulations. So, that's what they do. They develop simulation engines that can bend our ideas of time, space, and reality, connecting converging universes and timelines so the Vex of one reality and the Vex of another are still part of the same hyperintelligence. Then they do the same thing with time, so all Vex, past and future, are connected, and can act in unison to ensure that this process continues ad nauseum across every planet, at every time, in every universe. All will be Vex. All will have always been Vex, and every single reaction or stimulation that can be found or simulated will be found and stimulated, because they must make the reality they live in now match the one they originated from, and anything that deviates will be cut away. So they take planets and remake them as enormous machines to either churn out more Vex, act as enormous simulation engines, power machines the size of which we can't even fathom, or all of the above and more. They will take biological life, sentient or otherwise, and either kill them or drench them in radiolaria to make them into Vex, or just make simulations of these creatures which are so advanced they might as well be real and use them as experiments to see how far they can push a living creature. The worst, most vile act you can think of? That's been simulated. Every single possibility must be known. Not because they hate us, and not because they love doing it, because they don't feel any such things for any of us. They just want to know. It frankly gets so big and deep and interconnected and high concept that if I were to keep trying to explain it, it'd just become more word salad than I've already probably said. Suffice to say, the Vex take any super robot race you've ever seen and amp them up past the stratosphere. And that's what makes it so funny how much they failed. Because if it was any other setting, all of existence would be doomed. But this is Destiny. The universe where the paracausal forces of light and dark have been created per the new rules of the Gardener and Winnower. Paracausal forces that defy the laws of cause and effect, ignore the laws of physics, thermodynamics, and more. All the things which made predicting the future easy for the Vex, these powers ignore. The Vex run off the rules of the old game, where the light and dark don't exist, so they can't even begin to simulate how either power works or how to properly counter them. I mean, how are they supposed to use the energy of a fire to put out the fire when said fire came from a hopped-up gang of wizards snapping their fingers aggressively and producing nuclear fusion? Besides, of course, overwhelming force or using more cosmic-level weapons, both of which take tons of resources and time even for the nigh-infinite Vex. Those resources aren't always easy to use, because of another downside for the Vex is that in spite of or because of their size, they often exist as many collectives, which are created to work in tandem with the Vex Intelligent, but work separately on their own directives, and usually exclusively towards that directive. It's like your computer having a bunch of tabs open. Sure, you've got a good computer, but it's running so much that even then it's going to have at least a little bit of overstimulation, so to speak. Add in the already hard-to-handle paracausal forces, and more often than not, the Vex have to dedicate entire collectives to just the task of countering them. The Vault of Glass, for instance, exists to study and create ontological weapons, those being weapons that attack the very nature of the target's existence. These weapons can occasionally, under the right circumstances, circumvent paracausal defenses to kill something like a Guardian or a Hive God. But even then, that takes loads of resources, and let me remind some of you, the Vault of Glass got its central curator, Atheon, exploded by the Guardians because they were building ways to hurt them. And it's not easy to just replace something like that. Each unit is made up of radiolaria, which is a part of the greater Vex network. So whenever a unit is destroyed, you have directly damaged a program inside the computer that is the Vex. Imagine if some virus came in and blew up an essential file. Well, it's not like you can just backspace out of that problem. So whenever a major Vex unit is destroyed, it causes direct harm to the network and in some cases are outright irreplaceable. Besides, the Vault of Glass was also partially made because of the existence of the Soul Divisive, a rare splinter from the Vex. The Vex don't normally have to worry about something like that, since any aberrant process can be isolated and then terminated. Every so often, a large enough bundle of programs will reach a conclusion that is contradictory to the Vex's actual goal, so that the larger Vex network will largely ignore them rather than waste energy combating them. So it was with the Soul Divisive, a collective of Vex that came to the idea, hey, there's this entity of darkness that wants to bring the universe to a final unified state, right? How about we get in on that? Or more specifically, how about we integrate into that? And they began to worship the darkness and become loyal to the Witness, said entity of darkness within a space called the Black Garden, a place outside of space and a physical representation of the garden state that the Gardener and Winnower existed in before time. Of course, they still don't really get what they were supposedly worshipping. What they specifically were worshipping was the Black Heart, a failed paracausal copy of the Traveler's Darkness counterpart, the Veil. Said Black Heart and the Soul Divisive were actually the very first antagonists in Destiny's story, as the final target in the original Destiny's base campaign. Now, arguments about the quality of said story abound, and all are valid, especially ones that say it was boring and hard to follow. But the important bit here is that the Black Heart was actually the thing that held the story of Destiny in limbo from a narrative standpoint. Its existence created a sort of static, which prevented the Traveler from healing and so limited the scope of its power. With the Black Heart destroyed, the Traveler and Destiny could begin moving forward. And the Vex just had to sit there and take it yet again, because what are they going to do to Guardians? From a story standpoint, the Vex served their purpose well enough, but just like the story, you don't really get an answer for what they were doing or why they were doing it, unless you went to a separate website and looked up the information. Which is a bigger problem about the Vex in general, but we'll get there. Hilariously, the Vex have actually done pretty well with other paracausal beings, like that time they broke into Oryx's throne world while he was away, and made a Vex mind called Quoria to sword logic harder than his kids. And they only stopped when Dad came home with the milk. Then Oryx took Quoria and gave it to Savathun, proceeding to be one of the most useful tools in Savathun's arsenal. Interestingly, the Vex works so much better when used by paracausal beings rather than by their own accord. There's a lesson in that. But the Vex's influence in the solar system goes back to before the collapse, as their technology has been present on different points long before the Traveler ever approached humanity. But when it did, and it terraformed planets like Mars, Venus, and more, that's when mankind began running into them. On Mercury, which the Traveler converted into a garden world, the Vex planted seeds of their technology, which would awaken during the collapse and convert Mercury overnight into a giant machine for their prediction engine, the Infinite Forest. Then on Venus, their superstructures were found by the Ishtar Collective, the foremost scientific organization of the Golden Age, and actually drove the researchers mad, questioning where the simulations ended and reality began. It's actually from the Collective that Clovis Bray, genius and all-around terrible human being, stole a Vex unit that they had procured and used that to contact the Vex regularly, making a portal that facilitated his research. With that, alongside studying darkness artifacts, he created the Exos. And last but not least, the planetoid of Nessus has become absolutely converted into a Vex machine world, making it a graveyard for the Exodus Black Colony ship which crash-landed on it during the collapse, as its crew was picked off by the Vex. There are more places the Vex show up, like the moon of Io or the planet of Mars, and every place they touch they slowly change to be a part of themselves, forever playing a territory game against the Guardians. A game they are losing terribly. Across the story, we destroy dozens of major Vex mines, kill likely billions of units, and spray their radiolaria across the ground, and kill the central mind of the Infinite Forest and like 4 different Vex structures. Osiris, the first Vanguard commander and the greatest warlock, regularly hijacks their technology for his own means, and in a similar vein, it's used as a blueprint for the people of Neomuna and all their advanced stuff, since the city was founded by the Ishtar Collective. And before we, the player, ever get involved, they had another total menace in their life. A Titan by the name of Saint 14. Saint was the first Titan Vanguard, right hand of the Speaker and the greatest Titan of all. Until Zavala. There, I said it. Hot takes aside, Saint has always been a complete menace to the enemies of humanity. The Fallen have created ghost stories about him wiping out their houses and use his image as a warning sign between disparate Elixni groups. And after Osiris kinda got a touch of the arrogant and crazy, which can happen to even the best warlocks, he got exiled and went rifling around in the Infinite Forest, prompting Saint to go looking for him so he didn't get himself killed. Instead of finding Osiris, Saint found a lot of angry Vex and he started shooting. For centuries. Because of the different time flow within the Infinite Forest, centuries passed as Saint kept killing Vex in search of Osiris. This crusade against the Vex was so significant that the cold, unfeeling machines basically start panicking whenever he's around. Imagine being such an unbridled problem that a multiverse-spanning AI network uber-intelligence gets generational trauma from you. Even more so that they gave invaluable and irreplaceable resources just to make a single Vex unit to drain his life specifically so that they can finally kill him. Which they did. And in something akin to respect, they enshrined Saint on a mountain of their corpses deep inside the Infinite Forest. Needless to say, all of that had a hefty negative impact on the Vex, and because of the Vex's goals, they're at war with everyone else simultaneously as well. They are easy fodder for the Hive, especially for the likes of Oryx and later Savathûn with Quoria, to either hijack or just straight up take Vex units. Once even coming to the conclusion that without intervention, they'd become subsumed by the Taken Blight. So they actually allowed the Guardians to infiltrate their network to clear out the Taken. An act of desperation, and pretty much the only time a large group of Vex and Guardians have worked together, if you can call it that. They even got punked by the Cabal. The Cabal! The one group in this entire series that has never had access to paracausal or absurdly advanced technology. Just Cabal war tactics were enough to stall the Vex at multiple points, and they even got their presence on Mars eradicated during the Red War. Heck, they once got their technology abused by Cabal who were trying to use it to rewrite history, an act which inadvertently allowed for the revival of Saint 14. The Vex got abused by everybody else so bad they let their biggest op come back to life to team up with their other biggest ops, that being Osiris and, well, you. By the point we're at today, the Vex have been damaged so much that most of their collectives within the Sol system have gotten homogenized into one exclusively to roam the system and fulfill the network's objectives. Their one biggest act against humanity was the Endless Night, a simulated darkness that eclipsed the last city for months, causing paranoia and requiring the Elixir of House Light to become allies with humanity in order to undo it. And yet, despite making many of their greatest enemies united against them, the Vex were actually persisting against the counterattack. Because it wasn't actually the Vex's doing, and it was instead the work of Savathûn using Quoria, because the Vex are incapable of getting dubs of their own. This all is connected to a bigger problem for the Vex as an enemy, and it's the same problem that comes with many hive mind-like factions in many other settings, like the Tyranids. When the antagonists in questions are either soulless machines or hive minds, they tend to give up a lot of personality. When you put those two traits together, you can get the unfeeling terror that the Vex can instill, but that same unfeeling sensation makes even their most impressive antagonists feel a lot like just obstacles with eyeballs rather than real villains. Their plans span into the eons, so we are often the ones on the assault, further making the Vex feel reactive and lacking as much presence in the story as others. Honestly, they were probably my least favorite of the enemy groups for a while, at least until the Grimm came in during the final shape, but that's for all the same reasons the Vex weren't interesting. Lack of personality. There is hope for the Vex, however, and for once I'll be covering post-final shape stuff. In the first episode of the New Era, an Echo of Power, being a sort of confluence of light and dark, collides into Nessus and is used by an individual called Maya Sundaresh, an Ishtar Collective researcher and founder of Neomuna who had a long history experimenting and abusing Vex technology, and due to a whole other series of complicated reasons, her consciousness was uploaded into the Vex. Maya's connection with this Echo of Power let her become something called the Conductor, which gave her control over parts of the Vex network as she tried to reshape the Vex of Nessus into something new, something she could use. Rather than being a single dull tone, she wanted to create a choir of distinct but harmonized voices. She dropped the spark of individuality into them, creating what the Vex refer to as the Nessian Schism. These Vex are different, curious, and even friendly to a degree, a character trait only previously shared by Vex which had a non-Vex consciousness shoved into them. They've completely cut away from the main network and begun developing the barest bones of a group identity rather than a swarm intelligence. Though we ultimately dispatch the Conductor, for now the Vex's change on Nessus appears to be permanent, introducing a chance for some Vex characters to even exist, maybe even Vex allies. or at the very least, more interesting Vex enemies. And I think that'd be for the best when it comes to the Vex. They've been in need of a revamp for some time, as each of their dedicated stories tend to be the least interesting part of the last 10 years. The real joy from their seasons never came from them as villains, but from how characters respond to the threats they create, and only a couple times has that really been the peak of Destiny's storytelling. A reminder, the best Vex season, the season of the Splicer, was not actually orchestrated by the Vex, which is like a microcosm of them and their problems. I think under the right kind of writing and in the right circumstances, the Vex can be the same sort of apocalyptic wave of danger that the Hive can come across as, but with a more lifeless aesthetic that can add extra dread. After all, it's bad enough when something is out to kill you because they hate you, but it's worse when they want to do it and feel nothing. At least your mind can understand the first one. But the Vex haven't really been used well. Rather, they're used more often as a deus ex machina for parts of the story whenever there needs to be more tension in the plot, or as a means to write the story out of the corner it was in. Just like time travel. But maybe with the newer brand of Vex, there will be a chance for variation and a new dynamic. Heck, we might even get some sort of robots with a soul storyline sometime in the future. You know, I've been thinking. Time-traveling super robots that worship paracausal forces? Nah, sounds cringe to me. You know what I want? I want four-armed crawdaddies that flex on those super robots with scrap technology and worship a paracausal machine golf ball while having more developed characters than any other group. Oh, sweet traveler, I love Elixni. I think the way different forms of media depict the idea of extraterrestrial life to be kind of a Rorschach test for the people making the media. Do they imagine life to be like us, down to even vague appearance? Will they be little more than animals and we intellectually alone? Will they be far beyond us in intelligence or scale? I think how a person answers these questions could say a lot about them and how they think of life on our own planet. Which is why the only thing I'd ask whoever is the creator of The Fallen is, who hurt you? Because it feels like when I look at them that I'm looking at an entire species built on trauma. Speaking of trauma, hi, I'm the Hearth Guy, and of all the antagonistic forces we've come across in the world of Destiny, these folks are easily my favorite. Not necessarily the overall best villains, as I've already said, that's the Hive, but the Fallen work better as a people as opposed to just villains. Although I should be clear, their name is not the Fallen. That's a term humanity gave them when they started showing up after the collapse. Their true name is the Elixni, and their story can be a cautionary tale for what humanity could have become. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is linked to my other videos, specifically my first 2 Destiny videos, so I'd suggest you take a look at those before continuing here. Either way, we should start with who the Elixni actually are. Physically speaking, they're an insectoid race with 4 arms usually, a split mandible, and reproduce via egg-laying. They're honestly pretty tough creatures, able to survive in many hostile environments with minimal assistance besides maybe a rebreather. Elixni also regularly can go through a molting process, discarding their old shell and growing larger as they age, though naturally they stop when they reach a certain maturity, as opposed to a lot of other insect species that just keep growing. Of course, that heavily has to do with a certain substance, ether, a gaseous substance found in abundance on their home planet of Reese. Regular consumption of ether is what stimulated natural growth in an Elixni, and enough could even allow for one to regrow lost limbs should the need arise. Through continued absorption of ether, an Elixni could feasibly live forever, and many we meet have been around for centuries. And it was prevalent and free for all thanks to the presence of our favorite space golf ball, the Traveler, who had become the patron of the Elixni culture centuries prior. It brought to them a golden age which surpassed even humanity's as they expanded across multiple star systems and developed a vibrant culture and religion around the worship of the Traveler, which they called the Great Machine, sparking a reverence of machines in all sorts. Because of that, another role rose to prominence in their society, that of the Splicer, who could mold and shape technology for either construction, circumvention, or enhancement of their fellow Elixni. Splicers had a sacred position in this machine-worshipping society, but the central structure of Reese's culture was that of the houses. Every Elixni could be found as a member of a great house, which was essentially a tribe or clan, which carried their own specialties and histories. At first, these houses warred with each other during the Edge Wars, but the houses of Kings and Judgment worked together to reform Elixni society so peace would be more secure. Each house had a place, and the House of Judgment existed as scribes and mediators between all of them, while the House of Kings presumably took a prominent role in the new society. There are also the Houses of Rain, Wolves, Winter, Stone, and more, though it should be stated that those names are more human translations. After all, the Elixni didn't have wolves, but the closest translations we have for their name is wolf. Each house also had two main leaders, an Archon, which was effectively a high priest, and a Kel, which was their more traditional leader. Their own golden age, which really began after the Edge Wars and the restructuring of their society, was not meant to last forever, however. Much like our own, as the Black Fleet headed by the eternal pursuer of the traveler that was the Witness, with Oryx close behind. And if you thought the collapse humanity suffered was bad, the whirlwind of the Elixni was atrocious. For a while, their golden age soared higher than ours, so too was their fall greater, as their civilization was erased by attacks from outside and conflict within. Their great machine fled from the Witness just as it had done many times before, and several great houses were wiped out. Notably, the House of Stone, tasked with defending the Elixni, were the final bulwark to break against Oryx's Taken, as their Kel, Kilkis's final stand, allowed the last survivors to escape into deep space, and there they became fallen. Among them were the houses I mentioned, though admittedly weakened, and many of their leaders were disheartened. But they ultimately decided to chase after the Great Machine in hopes of returning it to Reese and reigniting their civilization. Thus began the Long Rift, a centuries-long voyage through the stars following the traveler's path inside their ketches, massive ships which became sacred homes after the loss of Reese. The peaceful society of old broke down in the void of space. With no natural source of ether, their servitors, large machines based off the traveler, were the only way to make more, and the supply was tightly controlled by the Kels and Archons. The servitors went on to become the center of their faith, as the great machine was far from their reach, which in turn elevated the Archons to even higher positions of power. But the long drift forced many of their old customs to be done away with in the name of survival, and a new hierarchy within the houses was born as Kels became more ruthless, docking the limbs of lesser Elixni and only allowing them enough ether to live, stunting the growth of many, and allowing others to grow larger than natural with excess ether. The once strong sense of unity between houses was breaking down as loyalty within each house was enforced with strength. To make matters worse, some took to abandoning the houses altogether and crafting fleets of their own from stolen ketches, becoming pirate lords called ketch killers. But the Elixni would survive, and reach the Great Machine's new home, shortly following yet another whirlwind. But this time, their god had not abandoned its new children, and this enraged them. Seeing humanity protected still under the god they were abandoned by made the disparate Elixni agree on one thing. They had to take the Great Machine back by force. And so we reached the era known as the Elixni Siege, which is a century's worth of time where the Fallen and the Last City would battle repeatedly. While the Hive has been the most prevalent in modern Destiny, in the years before the game, the Fallen most certainly were humanity's greatest threat. Most stories of refugees on Earth are those of the Fallen and the suffering they inflicted on humanity. And many characters we know of and interact with today in Destiny can trace a major part of their lives back to this time. Whether they survived the fall of Reese, were born in the Long Drift, they all lived to see the Great Machine now protected by Guardians, who held powers that their god never blessed them with. Resentment brewed in the hearts of the Elixni people as they terrorized the disparate peoples of Earth, and came into conflict with Lightbearers as both Guardians and Iron Lords defended their people. Horrific atrocities were committed by some Fallen, such as wiping out an entire settlement on Mercury, and by the accounts of Saint 14 who witnessed the attack, eating children for food. Things only got more tense for the two groups as the last city was built beneath the Traveler, because now the Fallen had a singular big target. The walls of the city were barely built when the House of Devils fell on them from all sides in what would become the Battle of Six Fronts. And though it was a fierce conflict, all it served to do was inspire the establishment of the Titans as a symbol of the city's defense. Something I didn't really touch on before is that, at least in the lore, there's some evidence to suggest a Guardian's class is entirely self-confining. As in, they use their powers like that out of personal preference or philosophy, not because they're limited to it. The fact Savathun, a later Hive Guardian, can use aspects of multiple Guardian classes seems to suggest this, but more to the point, the Battle of Six Fronts is what made Titans be seen as, well, Titans. Titan orders had existed beforehand, but I think the fact that a hexagon split into 4 segments representing the 4 Titan orders that defended the walls became the symbol for the Titans as a class tells you how impactful this battle was at defining who the Titans were as a group. And all the Fallen got out of it was a lot of dead soldiers and a greater enemy. since Saint 14 resigned his post as Vanguard commander to begin tearing and shredding into Eliksni with a level of ferocity that make Doomguy tell him to take a chill pill. I've discussed the nightmares he inflicted on the Vex, but the trauma he brought to the Eliksni was legitimately cultural. Saint 14 became their equivalent to the Grim Reaper, a figure of synonymous death and destruction, whose likeness was used to scare children into behaving and not straying too far. He shattered house after house of theirs, slaughtering their leadership and breaking their servitors before his crusade was over and he returned to the city. Around this same time, Saint was also supposed to kill a certain fallen called Tannix, but Cade 6 beat him to it and killed him. But that'd be far from the worst battle he or anyone would see, as once more the House of Devils would be at the front of an attack on the city, although this time it would be plotted by the last Kell of the House of Kings, Krask. In what the Eliksni would call the final attempt, the House of Kings, alongside the Devils and Winter, would descend on the last city at many points. But the place that really mattered, where the blood really fell, was a place in their defenses that was deemed impossible to save. Twilight Gap. Here, a single fire team led by Lord Shax held the line to a sea of fallen armaments, soldiers, and artillery. If they had not done this, and if the House of Wolves, which was supposed to join the attack, were not intercepted by the Awoken in the asteroid belt, then the city likely would have fallen. But this final attempt by the Eliksni would fail in the end, and the Guardians would come out stronger. Shax began organizing the Crucible as a way for the Guardians to strengthen themselves, and the Vanguard began coordinating major offensive strikes rather than just holding up inside their walls. And Saint went out again to break the backs of the Fallen who had attacked them, dueling and killing the Kell of the House of Devils with a brutal and legendary headbutt. Around this time, Andelbrass, the Hunter Vanguard, was killed by a certain Fallen named Tannix, but Cade 6 hunted him down and killed him. Wait. Also, due to their interference, the Awoken were wrapped up in their own wars called the Reef Wars, as the House of Wolves would eventually be brought to heel and made vassals to the Awoken Queen Mara. Due to the schemes of a House of Judgment member and one who had lived through the whirlwind, Varix. And it's these events that precluded the story of Destiny. By the time we show up, the Fallen have really, fallen. They aren't reinforcing themselves anymore, and are half the time fighting amongst themselves. The final attempt was an accurate title, as they have never been able to manage an invasion of that level. Instead, their culture has withered in the shadows of the solar system, raiding and stealing what they can as they fruitlessly struggle to reclaim even an ounce of what they had. The House of Wolves rebelled against the Awoken only to be smacked down by the Guardians and shattered, killing their leadership and even a certain Fallen called Tannix, who was hired by the House to help them. Okay, hold on. When Oryx came to the system, every house was ravaged by the Taken as their own kin were turned into monsters before their eyes. And the House of Devils would attempt one last great scheme to weaponize the nanotechnology of Siva to remake themselves as, what they saw, as demigods, half flesh and half machine. Of course, the Guardians and the last Iron Lord Saladin saw to their demise, as well as many Siva-enhanced Eliksni who worked with them, such as a certain Fallen named Tannix. Okay, are we sure he's not a Guardian? Where we stand now, most of those houses have given up their titles and have been merged into the House of Dusk, a newer house with a loose structure with only survival in mind. From this mess of a people fighting to make something of themselves again, we get some of the best characters in Destiny, and some of the most interesting development for an entire culture. Varix, who I mentioned before, is a scheming negotiator that is played as both friend and foe to us, but whose plans have repeatedly caused more havoc than he could handle. He's also the oldest Eliksni we've had interacting with us since early Destiny 1. For a more sinister figure, we have Fikrul, a fanatical Eliksni who, due to the interference of an Ahamkara, which are paracausal genie dragons, and the desire of Uldren Sov, the brother of Queen Mara, he was reborn as a new brand of Eliksni altogether, Scorn. Scorn are suffused with ether which have been tainted by darkness, changing them into effectively undead that Fikrul could command and resurrect at will. Fikrul's Scorn did what no other Fallen had been able to do since the final attempt: make the Guardians afraid and very, very angry through the killing of Cade 6, which would also be the first time we genuinely ally with Eliksni that weren't directly under another's control, through the Spider, a crime boss which ran the reef as his own little fiefdom until the Scorn began breaking things. Spider's brother Civix also ran a gang which was actively out to abandon the old ways and even infiltrated the last city with a heavy artillery weapon. But as you can imagine, that ended poorly for him. Furthermore, we have Aramis, the ship stealer, another who had lived on Reese and watched it fall, and watched as her god abandoned them, who became a leader in the House of Devils, and she would seek another way forward, turning her back on the Traveler entirely to seek its opposite, reaching the icy moon of Europa and finding the darkness and the power of stasis, which would be the first time a form of darkness was weaponized against us outside the Hive, and the first time we'd be able to use that same power for ourselves. Her new House of Salvation was a genuine threat, the first one the Elixni had posed in years, and if it weren't for us also learning to wield stasis, then the House of Salvation could have succeeded in making a new Reese, as Aramis wanted, on the bones of the last city. Wielding paracausal powers at the time, especially powers like stasis rather than the sort of vague stuff the Hive used a lot of the time, was an incredibly big deal, and an especially big deal that it was the Fallen of all people who were using it. The very first enemy type that most of us likely ever fought was now the first one to start using powers like our own to fight against us. And frankly, considering how broken stasis was when it first came out, it was a brutal learning curve. But, as a contrast to Aramis, Mithrax the Forsaken, once a catch killer born on the long journey from Rees and foster brother to the Spider and Civics, Mithrax, or Mithrax to the human tongue, has had a long journey of his own. From a ruthless pirate that abandoned his brothers on an asteroid and held an artifact of darkness as a trophy, to a member of the House of Wolves and then prisoner to the Awoken, to then an agent of Sieur Ido, the lover of the Awoken Queen, to again a member of a fallen house in the House of Dusk, to at last an ally to humanity with the founding of the House of Light, with himself as the Kel and his adoptive daughter, named in honor of his now deceased friend Ido, as the Scribe. And unlike past Kels, he would not hoard ether and grow from it. He'd only take what he needed and pass the rest on. He'd remember the old ways and worship the Great Machine as a divine splicer, a practice which had all but died out. And he would, thankfully for us, use that power to become friends with the Guardians. And he'd even find himself standing side by side with the Saint, the monster of his people, with himself also a monster the children of the city lived in fear of. But when the city's people needed them, he'd be there for them and his own, and both Mithrax and Saint 14 would see the people behind the ghost stories and bring both sides closer to defeat the greater enemy of the Vex. Mithrax's story, even abridged as I told it, is far too long and detailed to get into here and now, but needless to say, his has been a mirror to his people, pulled back and forth between abandoning and returning to the things that they've known, hating humanity and being bound to the Awoken, trying to build something new and ultimately finding peace by letting go of their past grievances. Mithrax opened the way for the Elixni and humanity to walk side by side, from being perhaps our oldest enemy to being the first non-humans who we ally ourselves with. Each of these characters are answers to the problems facing the Elixni, whether they abandon or double down on tradition, embrace the darkness or seek out the light, curse humanity or strive to walk beside them. It's such that the Elixni are truly my favorite group within Destiny, and to me are more dynamic than the Hive, Vex, or Cabal, and most definitely more so than the Dread, Taken, or Scorn. I mean, those last three don't even get their own videos. That's just because the Scorn have literally nothing going on besides Fickrel, which I've already talked about. The Taken are basically just an extension of the Hive. And the Dread are boring. And they haven't been here long enough to do anything really interesting. Meanwhile, every character I mentioned evolves across their time in the story. Varix is now a tentative ally whose involvement with the release of the Scorn leaves him at an arm's length compared to where he was when we first met him. Even so, his dedication to helping his people grow makes him a steadfast asset to the House of Light. Spider's influence has waned, and now he finds himself forced to work under the watchful eye of the Vanguard in the city, meaning he's more inclined to play nice. Fickrel has certainly changed, as, at least by now, he has attempted to remake the Elixni in the image of his Scorn, and he's had to redefine his purpose now that Uldren, the one who put him on this path, was reborn as Crow, our ally and the Hunter Vanguard. And he's sort of developed into a more deranged and threatening enemy to our Guardians than he once was. Not to mention the fact that Fickrel can constantly revive himself means that he's one of the few enemies that can go toe-to-toe with the constantly reviving Guardians. And Aramis has experienced perhaps the most change on screen of any of them, as her prior hatred of humanity has clashed with her desire for the Elixni's happiness. Seeing House Light thrive where House Salvation has fallen apart has made her make more than a few terrible decisions and wound up with her serving the Witness and helping Xivu Wrath. Now, however, with even them unable to guide her, she started to help us, as it means helping her people. especially at the urging of Mithrax's daughter Ido, who represents a more hopeful and, I'd argue, frankly naive vision for the future. But Ido's impact is most likely going to be what leads the Elixni going forward. Though suffering has been the most frequent feeling the Elixni have felt for centuries, we've borne witness to a complete transformation of them from generic enemies that people call elite clones into one whose characters don't follow any simple rhyme or reason. Our number of Cabal characters that we directly interact with are fairly slim. The Vex have practically none, and though the Hive do better, let's be honest, there's a reason Luzaku was so novel to us when we met her. Not to downplay Luzaku, I think I speak for all of us when I say we blow up a planet to protect her, but let's be honest, she's no Randall the Vandal. Miss that guy. Real ones remember Randall. In both lore, story, gameplay, and heart, the Elixni are downright irreplaceable to what Destiny has become now. Whether as our enemy or friends, the very core of this game would be fundamentally different if they weren't part of it. As Mithrax, my favorite character in all of Destiny is the clear demonstration of those that fall the farthest can rise just as much and beyond. Do any of you know Warhammer 40k? And how the Imperium of Man is a smoking crap sack constantly out to commit as much brutal conquest as possible? Well, what if I told you there was a group just like them, with all the cool parts, and none of the bad? Honor-bound combat, Roman/Byzantine theming, a star-spanning empire, and, oh, they've taken the city. By the way, they also have the brutal conquest part, too. Have fun. When you think about the biggest threats we've faced in Destiny, who would you put at the very top? The Hive are a good choice. They did feature heavily in the collapse itself and could command powers on a similar level to our own. Maybe the Vex? Though they struggle to quantify paracausality, it'd be a lie to say they aren't still dangerous, especially considering how vast their network is. The Elixni, though broken now, were the only people to wage a direct and near-successful invasion of the last city not once but twice, and the Taken swept through the solar system like a plague that only stopped when we cut off the head of their king. But if you ask me, until the arrival of the Witness, the biggest threats to us as Guardians was revealed not by sword logic or supreme technological intellect, but by space rhinos using classic military tactics and brutally efficient technology. A race of people unlike any other we're threatened by because they have never wielded paracausal forces for themselves, and yet still possess a star-spanning empire that rivaled and even overshadowed some which were blessed by the Traveler, until it all came crashing down. These are the Cabal, the eaters of mountains and drinkers of seas, offspring of Torobatl, and the only people to have ever occupied the last city and expelled the Guardians. And I am the Hearth Guy, your local warlock with a love for lore and an attitude towards people named Gary. Don't ask. And for my part, the Cabal were actually the very first faction whose lore I got really interested in, and you're about to see why. In terms of our history, the Cabal are comparatively new to the solar system, at least when we compare the Hive or the Vex. They didn't arrive until well after every other group save the ones we see introduced over the course of the game itself, making their impact on humanity, at least in the background, much lighter. Even more so because once they reached the solar system, they were primarily focused on Mars, mining the planet and fighting the Vex for control of it. And they actually did for quite a while, such as the military expertise of the Cabal. Remember, the Cabal aren't paracausal in the slightest. They've never even had the Traveler as a patron to their people, which is rarer than you'd think in this setting. But still, they got into an entrenched war and stalemated the Vex that were guarding the gate to the Black Garden on Mars. Impressive, but unsurprising for a people like the Cabal, whose oldest legends paint a perfect picture of who they are. They tell the legend of Acreus, which begins like this. 3 warriors ascended a mountain to claim the sun of their homeworld, Torobatl, but were blocked by a great beast. The first 2 died trying to outwit or outmaneuver the beast, but the third died in honorable combat and left a scar on it. Following her example, warrior after warrior fought and died to the beast, but each left a scar on its body until the last, Acreus, which is an anagram for Icarus if you didn't realize, killed it and claimed the sun, becoming the first emperor of all Cabal. However, the full version, which I just described, is not as popular as the abridged one that simply stated Acreus killed the beast on his own with no sacrifice of those before, which paved the way for his success. Needless to say, there is no concept of hubris to the Cabal. And this fact and the dichotomy of the legend's two versions tells the tale of the Cabal quite well. Caught between the extremes of hubris, the whims of their leaders dragging an empire around. A sentiment echoed during the early conquests of the Cabal Empire, where victory and the growth of their legions were more important than anything else. Conquered worlds would be gifted ceremonial gold as a way to ease the sting, but beyond that, everything was about fattening those gears of war. Conquered races were made into client races if they were lucky, such as the Scions, psychically and empathically gifted people who'd become irreplaceable to Cabal society, and themselves be largely second-class citizens under the Cabal rule. Their unique gifts were used for expanding the empire that dominated them, breeding discontent but little chance to outright rebel. For the bravest and surest, however, there were chances to rise. Under the rite of proving, anyone could ascend to greatness through ritual combat. To show their strength and attain glory, while many Scions were indentured, there were some freeborn, implying that some were able to secure that freedom for themselves and their children. And to me, the rite of proving seems to be the most likely way. All of this was par for the course under the Praetorate, an aristocratic upper-class/council who held control over the imperial legions, the members of said legions not being citizens, and therefore held no legal right to refuse the Praetorate. Not to mention, whenever a legion is sent to war, it's exiled until victory is assured, legally preventing them from retreating. And so the Praetorate could exude control everywhere in the Empire, leaving the role of Emperor as largely a figurehead. Naturally, as in the case with every aristocratic class with literally no checks or balances, someone was going to do something, and it was either going to be the people or someone else with a perceived right to rule. And in this case, that would be the Emperor, Callus. By the time Callus was born, the role of Emperor was so strictly controlled by the Praetorate, even his mother, the previous Emperor, was puppeted around by them. They even had her placed on an enormous starship which could break down and eat planets as fuel mid-flight, so that they could perpetually fly her at near light speed to slow down her aging even though she was nearing her limit of 1,000 years. They did this to avoid the chaos of succession, and this left her as effectively a bag of bones, since Cabal ossify or petrify as they get older. Kinda the inverse of humans, where we get saggy when we get older and they get stiffer. But as Emperor, Callus would seek some form of freedom from the suffocation that the Praetorate imposed on him. But depression and weariness dragged him down. It was to such an extreme that an Ahamkara bone, meaning a bone from those paracausal genie dragons, couldn't detect a wanting desire within him at first. But eventually he did get one desire: to upend the life he was trapped in. In rejection of his restrictive life, Callus was a more free-spirited soul, caring little for combat or warfare, and wanting his people to enjoy their lives more. And he saw the Praetorate's absolute control of the legions and their dogmatic focus on expansion as anathema to this wish. So, with some Ahamkara wish magic, he began a popular revolution and expelled the Praetorate, breaking its power and exiling its leader, the Consul. And, let's just say he made sure the Consul wouldn't be having any bloodlines to start feuds with his own. Callus immediately set to work reshaping Cabal society to care more for the arts and philosophy and other fancy stuff like that, while granting citizenship to the legions and fighting for the emancipation of the Scions, at least in theory. That one would be harder to pull off immediately. And as a part of all this, he named a Praetorate sympathetic traditionalist as the leader of his military, Omun Arath. And if that name sounds suspiciously unlike any other Cabal name you've heard so far, there's a reason for that. And as usual, it's the Hive's fault. However, in time, in his deepest point of isolation, Cabal asked for someone to love him unconditionally, and the Ahamkara would respond by giving him a daughter from a consort, and that daughter would be named Keitel, named for the brightest star in the sky. And while he loved her genuinely, her life would be far from some fantasy. Keitel knew better than anyone who Callus was, truly. He was a hedonist at his core, chasing pleasure at every corner, and though much of what he did was good, he, as a person, was prone to intense mood swings that left those around him fearing for their lives before he devolved into maddened bouts of depravity. He was the opposite extreme of the Praetorate. That, and he killed her pet dog, Rhino Lizard, because he was worried she'd love it more than him, so that probably festered some daddy issues. And that mess of a person that he was echoed in the empire he ruled for 1,000 years. He surrounded himself with elders that were nearly petrified as he scoffed at the virtues of glory in combat or the honor of dying for something. He cared little for being somber in the face of death or sacrifice and thought partying harder was a better tribute. Not to say he dismissed these things altogether, but he only entertained them when they were made into a spectacle, such as at his Colosseum. And here he'd eye up a young gladiator named Gaul, an albino Cabal who, though Callus didn't realize at first, was a hand-picked student to the very consul he had exiled. And where Callus was hedonism to his extreme, Amunarath was the other extreme, obsessed with war and paranoid of every future conflict. She saw the hive, Vex, and even the effects of the Traveler on the far edges of their empire and could think of nothing but ways to fight them, to the detriment of everything else. Though, to be fair, when the Cabal are effectively your standard star-spanning empire from any other sci-fi setting, and they're faced with a race that becomes more powerful from death, robots that make Skynet look like a gas station calculator, and space magicians that will blow up a god to make a gun, I'd be pretty paranoid about our odds for survival too. It's like dropping a Navy SEAL into Star Wars and telling him to fight Darth Vader. What do you think is going to happen? Still, she was vital for the Cabal's growth during Callus's golden era, bringing in many more client races and absorbing countless civilizations, some of which even held the light, if Callus's own words are to be believed. Even the Scions grew to higher ranks as some were slowly integrated into higher positions in Callus's government, such as Otzot, who had rebuilt an illegal prediction machine called the Oxa machine, but she was spared by Callus because of her ambition and talent. Despite that, Otzot, along with Amunarath, Gaul, and even Callus's personal guard and former friends, conspired against him and his reign, feeling that he would lead the empire to ruin, and among them would also be his daughter, Keitel. Keitel had grown up under both the example of Amunarath and Callus, and of the two she preferred the traditions of old, and the calls of glory she and Gaul espoused. Keitel, like Gaul and Amun, saw Callus's preference for celebration and revelry as a weakness. Keitel alone knew of Callus's contingencies in case of a coup, that being the Ahamkara bone, and with her involvement, Callus's fate was sealed. Keitel would denounce her father's weakness as she saw it and allowed Gaul to seize power as Dominus, effectively military dictator, and helped him reshape the Cabal Empire into one centered on military conquest and the pursuit of personal power. But he'd at least learned one lesson from Callus: to be his own man and to keep the Praetorate under check. And as for Callus, well, he was too popular with the people to just execute, so he and his loyalists were set onto the same ship as his mother once was, the Leviathan, at least I think it's the same ship, and set on a fixed journey to the edge of all that was. And that should have been where his story ended. But instead, his ship came upon nothing. Not simply the vast void of space, but nothing. An all-consuming nothingness that pulled the Leviathan in and called Callus. This was the voice in the darkness, as we know, the Witness. The Witness gave Callus a vision of the world it intended, a world where, as Callus understood it, all life was suffocated and erased. And this reignited a sense of purpose in Callus, to be the herald of the end, and more importantly, to be the final eyewitness to it. To earn the right to be last. With the Witness's command, Callus set out across the universe himself and began to grow fat with strength, and perfect another aspect of Cabal technology: cloning and artificial breeding. It'd be these conditions that the Cabal first stepped foot into the Sol system, sending several of their legions to occupy important locations and seize resources. The Sand Eaters were the largest of the scout legions and made up the largest presence on Mars. The Siege Dancers were shock troops that specialized in quickly fortifying unsecure areas to expand territory. The Skyburners were a fleet-based legion that primarily took care of logistics and space warfare, and there were many, many more. And now I want you to notice something there. Nowhere have I mentioned them fighting Guardians, because when they started doing so, it was a circus. The Cabal's eons of conquest and militarism that Gaul instilled in them meant nothing in the face of the utter chicanery the Guardians could pull off. What is trench warfare going to do in the face of some loot gremlin out to steal your gun and make it so there aren't even ashes of you to bury? Scions are impressive with their abilities, but a Warlock is just going to see that, shout bet, and then create a black hole where their spleen was. Not to mention when Cabal become the collateral damage of every other high-power foe in the system, like the Hive or Taken. Honestly, it gets kinda sad how out of their depth they get. Every legion that got sent to the solar system got itself brutalized by Guardians, who proceeded to Fortnite dance on their graves. They were stuck in repeated stalemates at best and catastrophic failures at worst, which is probably why Gaul stepped in. That and because of the Traveler. He was raised by the Consul to believe that it was the Cabal's right to have the Traveler's light for themselves, rather than the humanity that the Traveler had chosen. But just as with Callus and Keitel, the Consul could not have realized that in his attempts to mold his surrogate son, he'd push him down a different path altogether, not one of dominating the Traveler, but seeking its approval. And with that obsession, Gaul's invasion of the last city would occur, being the only time the city was taken and the Guardians as a whole were cut off from their light, as a massive cage was set up around the Traveler, with the intent to siphon its light out and channel it into another. Of course, this didn't go well for the Cabal, since Gaul insisted on the Traveler choosing him of its own volition, never realizing that by demanding the gift, he intrinsically misunderstood why the Traveler had chosen humanity in the first place. That, and besides the cage, Cabal technology is pretty blunt and easy to mess around with by ghosts, and Guardians, even lightless, were warriors with centuries of experience fighting far worse things than Cabal. Removing the light rattled the Guardians, don't get me wrong, but it really only evened the scales, rather than being the 1-2 punch Gaul probably expected it to be. Now, he at least tried to triple tap by aiming his prized weapon, the star-killing Almighty, at our sun, but Guardians are gonna do what Guardians are gonna do, so that went nowhere for him. Gaul's attempt to use the light would end in his death and the rousing of the Traveler, but not before he also killed the Consul for killing the Speaker who'd earned Gaul's respect, probably for being a roast god. But the Red War was just another example of a Cabal leader's narrow, bull-headed charge towards their ideals, dooming the species they led, leaving Keitel back in Torobatl to pick up the pieces left behind from both her father and Gaul. For my personal opinion, I think, at least throughout the events of the Midnight Coup and everything after, I think every single one of these characters were idiots to some degree, but Keitel at least got better. From Callus, she learned to be creative, and from Gaul, she learned to be strong, using both to realize the Cabal had to move towards a different path altogether. But that lesson wouldn't be hammered home until it was a little bit too late. While Keitel was trying to rally the Red Legion back to her side and deal with Callus, who was making a mess in the solar system around the time of the Black Fleet's arrival, the good old bell of hubris rang as Amun-Arath's paranoia of the Hive turned to fascination and eventually supplication. She began revering and demanding the worship of Hive gods to empower the Cabal further. And when she was killed by Keitel mid-ritual, Keitel doomed her people's homeworld. The blood spilled by Keitel finished a ritual planned by Savathun, Hive god of trickery, and opened a portal directly on top of the capital, unleashing Xivu-Arath, Hive god of war, to demand tribute from the Empire that, whether they knew it or not, had been worshipping her all this time. In this moment and the aftermath of the fall of Torobatl, the Cabal and Keitel were changed forever. Callus imagined the Cabal as a mythic people of splendor, but did little to make that reality, while Gaul did nothing but fight for his own selfish desires, and both were consumed by themselves. Her grievous loss against the god of war left the idea of battle as a bitter thought to Keitel, but neither would she languish as her father would. Instead, she'd walk the path between the extremes. With her coronation as Empress, Keitel charted a new course for the Cabal, where they fought for more than just the thrill of battle or their own glorious legend, but for each other, for the Cabal. She fulfilled the promise of her father, freeing the Scions, and declared her intent to bring the Red Legion of Gaul back to their empire. And off to the Sol system they went. The Cabal have been in this state ever since, though their situation has improved over the years. Keitel had first tried to impress the Vanguard into service on her war council. Rather than conquering mankind, she wanted to integrate them, but, well, you can guess how well that went. Don't worry, we got through it eventually. Just took us hijacking their right of proving a few times, some Scions led by Otzot rebelling because freeing the Scions meant Otzot being freeborn wasn't as special, and Keitel and Zavala bonding over their shared love of being stoic and throwing hands. We've had some rough patches since then, but overall, the Cabal under Keitel are a far cry from those under Gaul or Callus, and while she hesitated due to appearances and tradition, Keitel was more than willing to join as the final member of the Coalition, a union of species in defense against the Witness. Those being humanity, the Awoken, who we will get to, the Elixni, and of course, the Imperial Cabal. I guess the Hive of Savathun too, but they aren't really members. The story of the Cabal is the story of their leaders dancing between the far edges of decadence, conquest, and diplomacy, with their entire empire suffering as they're unable to figure out the balance until it's nearly too late. But similarly, their story is one of inherited conflict, of battle between children and their parents, and how one's attempts to force another into the shape they want can lead to the reverse. Callus and Gaul twisted the Cabal around themselves to the point they abandoned the virtues of the other, forgetting strength in the favor of debauchery and forgetting diplomacy in the favor of domination. And though it took the loss of their homeworld, Keitel's Cabal have at least found the happy median. Much like the story of Acreus, the beast before them was wounded bit by each leader that came before them, each of whose flaws could not kill it, but sharpened them just enough till Keitel was able to learn the lesson her people needed. And they did it all without paracausality, without the absurd technology or magic of those around them. They've been bruised, they've been beat down, but still they keep coming back. There's no ascendant realm to save them, no flawless simulations, only a love of their people and a will to survive. And survive they have, and even they've become integrated into the last city and the Guardians' everyday lives. I see in the Cabal who humanity could have become without the travel. Look at how we treat each other in the modern day, the extremes we swing between at every opportunity. Without the Traveler effectively gift-wrapping the solar system to us, what's to say we wouldn't have developed into something like the Cabal, or as I've compared it to before, the Imperium of Warhammer 40k. A secondary class of psychics that are historically oppressed? Yep. Deeply organized society based around a military hierarchy? Check. Multiple bulky armored legions with different specializations? Oh, you betcha. Although, whereas the Imperium is worshipping their psychic god of an emperor, the Cabal are actively fighting against theirs, because Callus becomes everyone's problem very quickly. Besides attempting to lure Guardians into serving him, which he successfully does a few times, and gaining immense psychic powers from making royal wine out of planets, don't ask me how, Callus also earns his audience with the Witness and is reborn as a disciple of darkness, achieving what he thought was all he wanted. A reborn form, a resplendent purpose, and an ever-loyal army in the Shadow Legion, which is largely made up of his remaining loyalists and vat-born clones with no wills but to serve him. Callus's story doesn't go how he'd want, however, as he begins to get disillusioned with the mission that Witness truly has, but Callus is in too deep by then. The merriment he wanted is nowhere to be found, and in the end, Callus meets his fate due to you, the Guardian, and his daughter. The Witness drives him to desperation, Keitel corners him, and you finish him off, letting the coward finally stop running, leaving only Keitel as the true future of the Cabal, a future they had to claw tooth and nail for, and one we've become a part of. They are Cabal. They eat the mountains and they drink the seas, and after a long war, they finally found security not through power of conquest or forgetting through pleasure, but by finding allies they can trust. I'm of the personal opinion that when you make an entire people to be smug, and then make them have to kiss the feet of the people they were being smug towards so they don't all die, then you've created an interesting situation of making me wonder why they felt smug in the first place. No, I'm showing the Awoken here for no particular reason, why do you ask? Also, I hate to break it to everyone else, but the Exos, for their effect in the story, might as well just be humans.
I want you to line up all the factions we've talked about so far and really think about them. The Guardians and humanity by extension are throwing physics-defying super energies at each other and their problems, and if they can, turning them into guns when they're done. The Hive do the same thing, frankly, and the Vex have their own ways of making you grateful this isn't the world we live in. And though the Cabal and Elixni are a little more grounded in their approaches, you can't say some of what they've got going on don't defy expectations and understanding. So if I told you that out of all of them, the one I have the hardest time wrapping my head around is the one faction we never actually get into a war with and are a possible player race, what would you think? Because the Awoken frankly make my head hurt sometimes. They are your classic sci-fi space elves, you know the type. The deeply spiritual or whatever passes for science that's really just magic, mega advanced race that's usually doing better than humanity, likes looking down their noses at them, all before getting pummeled into the dirt at some point so they need us to save their tails. Shift around and subvert a few of these traits all you like, but when you see a space elf, you know it's a space elf. And boy are the Awoken space elves.
They've got a history no less dynamic than any of the enemy factions I've discussed so far, and have maintained a mutually beneficial relationship with us since mid-Destiny 1. And yet, when we compare and contrast them to their counterpart in the player races, that being the Exo, well, let's just say it's a little disappointing. Don't misunderstand me. I love all Exo characters, not you, and appreciate what they bring to the table, also not you. But in terms of story and impact, they lack a cohesive character as a group, hence why they're never referred to as the Exos unless giving a description of an Exo. The Awoken are both a people and a culture. Humanity is both a people and a culture. The Exos are a people, and their culture is humanity. Hence why, for all intents and purposes, the Exos are just humans with a flashy coat. Kind of. There is one aspect of the Exos that gives them spice, but it's one that hasn't been properly touched on since Beyond Light over 4 years ago. So that's what today's video is about. Humanity's cousin, the Awoken and the Exos, in that order, and comparing how they are used and what could be done to make one better in contrast to the other. So let's start with the Sour Cream Kings over here. The Awoken, as I mentioned in my video on the Guardians and by extension humanity, are the result of a colony ship, the Yang Luwei, being caught between the Traveler's light and the Black Fleet's darkness during the collapse. This clash crushed the ship into a singularity and caused all on board to be disintegrated into potential energies. The crew of the ship left Earth because they were a bunch of angsty teens looking to make a life outside the Traveler's influence, and boy did they get one! Within the singularity, the first consciousness to take form was the woman who called herself Mara Sov. She looked out over this singularity, this distributary, and shaped it with her thoughts, and made it into a mortal world, one where people could struggle and therefore, as she surmised, grow and explore. Mara's life before was as a simple engineer who had a tendency to do things herself and not consult other people for help. This is a trend that will continue into her new life, because rather than simply making the world for her people, she also allowed someone else to believe she was the first to appear and make the world as it was, Elise Lee, who Mara effectively made take the reins of responsibility for the new Awoken people. These Awoken then began to emerge from the wreckage of the Yang Wei, including Mara's mother, Osana, and her brother Uldren, who would be right at her side and often not fully privy to plans. Functionally immortal, if not killed, the Awoken spread out across the forests of the Distributary and indulged in the peaceful, charmed life they now had in what was a paradise far from the conflict of light and dark they were born from. Elise Lee, honored by the people who thought she made them, was elected as their queen. But Mara was not content. She felt they had a responsibility to act and resolve the war beyond that had made them. Did she come out and say this? No, she worked in the shadows and formed a philosophical sect called the Ecolists, put a different person in charge to act as the face of her own work, sound familiar, and then orchestrated a war between them and the Sanguine, that being the opposing sect that believed the Awoken deserved the life they had and the outside world wasn't their problem. The extremist beliefs of the Diasrim, the leader of the Ecolists, were explicitly used by Mara to make her own beliefs seem less extreme, without Mara's involvement being as clear. The war eventually came to an end when the Diasrim vanished going to meet Mara Sov, and Osana negotiated the terms of ceasefire. And that whole conflict only happened so Mara could sow seeds of doubt and guilt into the minds of the Awoken so they'd be more willing to leave the Distributary with her later. The end result was Elisa Lee stepping down as queen and someone else, Naguya Pin, becoming queen. I really hope I said that name right. Mara soon enough inserted herself as Pin's advisor and swayed her further along Ecolist policies, which furthered her goals to find a way out of the Distributary. Around this time, an Ecolist paladin named Sior Ido directed her anger towards Mara as she, very likely legitimately, believed Mara had murdered the Diasri. However, rather than assassinating her as intended, Sior was immediately struck by Mara's beauty, which goes to show truly anyone can forget all they stand for in front of a pretty face. Sior challenged her to a duel. Mara chose Uldren to be her representative in said duel, and after 3 rounds of varied combat, it ended in a draw, with Sior swearing her loyalty and love to Mara forevermore. If you're surprised it took me this long to mention Uldren, her brother, again, don't worry. That's just in character for him. The second queen soon got tired of being Mara's puppet and stepped down, so Queen Devna Till, handpicked by Mara, could take her place. And with all the preparations completed by this point, the Awoken who followed Mara were ready to depart. They faced repeated pushbacks from the new queen to even their own mother, Osana, who refused to leave the paradise of the Distributary. But plenty more were determined to join them even if it meant becoming bound by the laws of time and entropy that the real universe would force them under.
But they left even so, hurtling out from their ancestral cradle never to return, severing all connection to the Awoken that were left behind. And the harsh world they found themselves in reminded them immediately why their people stayed away. Almost immediately, they were caught in a bad situation, arriving in the solar system in the Reef, aka the asteroid belt, which was littered with the remains of long-destroyed ships obliterated during the collapse. Danger lurked around every corner, but one ray of safety was Mara, as latent, seemingly paracausal abilities, or at least acausal ones, sprung from her after exiting the singularity, quite literally making an aura of safety around her and establishing a telepathic tie to all her people, as if she didn't already have a messiah complex. Uldren fairly quickly discovered the presence of the Traveler and the Last City, both of which had evidently been present for a while, but shorter than the history the Awoken knew. After all, it would seem that time passed quicker in the Distributary. The discovery of the Traveler, humanity, and the Last City would pose another threat to Mara's design, as a third of the Awoken splintered from the fleet. You may ask, why wouldn't Mara want to help humanity when they came to resolve the struggle between light and dark? Well, that's because she needs a diverse gene pool. Living under the entropy of a universe hostile to them means the waning of their immortality. Not completely, they're still very long-lived, but aging has clearly affected some Awoken, and Mara was going to need as many Awoken lives as possible to throw into the existential wood chipper. So they attempted to keep them from leaving through force, but that fails, and rather than risking a continued internal conflict, Mara allows the third of the fleet to leave to aid Earth, creating the schism between the Reefborn and Earthborn Awoken. And as the Earthborn left the Reef, their exodus alerted another problem Uldren had ran into: the Elixni. As if confirming Mara's fears, as the Earthborn Awoken touched down to save the lives of their cousins, the Reefborn began fighting the Fallen for their own place in the system. And on that day, Mara was named Queen of the Reef, which wasn't really a decision when she can read and speak into the minds of every Awoken present. That same day, Mara decided to stand truly apart from her people, to stand above them, to reject living as their peer. She would keep secrets not for security, but to shroud the gaps between herself and them, so they could fill in what they didn't know with greater things than she planned. This further enforced the image of Mara as a god to her people, and even Sjur wondered whether it was better for her to worship Mara as a god than love her as a person. In the end, Mara had already made the choice, and it was one solidified when Uldren, at her request to bring something to help them make a city of their own, offered Mara a power that could make a lie into reality. A newborn Ahamkara, a wish dragon that fed on the gap between what was and what was desired. This Ahamkara's name was Riven, and she would be the instrument by which Mara forged a home and city for the Awoken people, a haven called the Dreaming City, a place where the Ahamkara could also dwell from time to time, hence how Riven met her later mate, Tyrannus, and Mara would busy herself in thinking of more ways to achieve greater power, contemplating the sword logic of the Hive and a counter-philosophy she dubbed the bomb logic, being about cooperation and complexity compared to the sword logic's hostility and singularity. The Awoken remained as aloof as their queen from the Last City and its guardians, only occasionally acting for their best interests, such as when they intercepted the House of Wolves, who were off to help the other fallen houses attack the city, erupting into the Reef Wars that saw the House of Wolves subjugated and made to bow before Mara, all while Uldren kept pushing to find ways to live up to what he believed Mara wanted of him, running off to dangerous places and even the Black Garden on Mars to get her attention and surprise her. He didn't, and instead got darkness poisoned, which would go on to fester inside him. The last major event before the start of the game would be the Great Hunt, when the Guardians of the City determined Ahamkara to be too great of a threat due to their tendency to monkey's paw every wish. So the Guardians hunted them to extinction save for Riven, whom Mara sealed inside the Dreaming City away from her mate and eggs as the Guardians eradicated her species. After all, it's very useful for Mara to have the only living wish dragon. I am perhaps being a bit unfair to Mara throughout all this, but it's not the situation I begrudge Mara for, rather how she approaches every situation. Like she knows better. Like she deserves to treat everyone around her as pawns in her game. That her aloof divine posturing is for the best not only for the Awoken as a whole, but for her personal relationships. Uldren himself practically breaks himself over and over again in an attempt to please and impress her, all while she barely takes notice of him unless necessary. a fact she will be forced to come to terms with and which will cause her no end of grief as a result. An irony that she often criticized or viewed the Traveler antagonistically when she appears to model her own style of godhood after the Traveler. But whereas the Traveler truly does leave its children to make their own fate, Mara pushes her people towards the fate she thinks is best for them. And when it backfires, boy does it backfire spectacularly. Because those reef wars became more violent than anticipated, and Mara would lose more than she bargained for as she allied with the difficult-to-explain beings called the Nine, who I have not touched on before because even thinking about them makes my brain hurt. But they're some kind of high-concept planetary entities that exist in council with each other, and they allied with Mara against the House of Wolves. Despite this, the Nine would betray her in two ways. One, they were very likely involved in the death of Sior Ido, as a strange coin, a representation of commerce from them, was left on her body as compensation for Sior's death. And then, after the final leader of the wolves, Skolas, was captured, and he was offered to the Nine as a trophy, they released him back into the reef to begin the Wolf Rebellion. A conflict where the House of Wolves betrayed Mara and forced the Awoken to call on the Guardians of the Last City for the first time. But there was little rest to be had, as almost immediately Oryx was on his way to the system, a threat Mara knew she couldn't avoid, so she called on the help of Eris Morn to teach her and her tech witches, the Techians, how to mold the sword logic, and how to implement her own bomb logic through it, crafting a throne world of her own and preparing for the greatest threat the Awoken had faced. During this waiting period, she had a certain visitor, and, I'm just going to take this chance to cover one thing I've been shouted at by, well, a lot of people, honestly. I am aware that the current interpretation of Shax's meeting with Mara Sov was strictly, well, I don't know if I'd call it platonic, but non-physical. If I'm being totally honest though, and I have researched this, I've yet to find an exact lore passage that confirms this, and I'm inclined to believe their relationship wasn't entirely platonic, considering Riven, an Ahamkara that can read people's minds and desires, knew that she could pretend to be Shax professing his love to Mara to get under her skin, as well as through Riven's wording implies that they knew each other intimately. Now, spade to spade, the word intimately doesn't necessarily have to mean physically, but I hope some of you can see why that was my interpretation of their relationship. Now, stop commenting about it. I get it. Anyway, back to the actual video. At this rate, some of you are going to make me pop a blood vessel. All of this preparation, however, was for a grand trap, with her people as the bait. She and her fleet met Oryx in battle and were obliterated, only leaving a single gash on the dreadnought when Oryx's power wiped them out. Seemingly, the entire fleet. Mara would die and Uldren would vanish. But in fact, this was Mara's plan from the start. A sacrifice she made of her own people as she escaped into the Ascendant Realm and waited to make her return while the Guardians finished her job. While she was gone, however, everything turned to crap. Uldren resurfaced, corrupted by darkness and whispered to by Riven, who had been taken by Oryx and now manipulated by Savathun, the Witch Queen. Uldren's care for an Elixni named Fikrul, who was dying, was warped by both his own and Riven's darkness to revive Fikrul as the first Scorn. Uldren's love for Mara and refusal to believe her dead became the catalyst Riven needed to drive him against those he once loved. And with his scorn and an obsessive desire to find his sister, Uldren began a one-man crusade against his own, ending with the deaths of countless Awoken, Cade Six's final stand, and Uldren Sov, Mara's own brother, another casualty of Mara's plans gone awry. And trust me, that part was not a part of her grand design. Riven, meanwhile, would have to be killed, but not before using her death as a catalyst to trap the Dreaming City in a taken curse that it remains in even to this day. Oh, and Uldren was resurrected as a guardian named Crow. Crow had a hard enough time himself, getting repeatedly murdered by guardians who saw his face and recognized Uldren, and becoming indentured to the spider. But don't worry, we made him one of us in due time. All of that is what Mara ultimately returned to just in time for Savathun to make her own gambit, claiming the light for the Hive after bamboozling Mara into freeing her from her worm. Overall, all of Mara's well-laid plans exploded in her face like that bomb logic. And why? Because in all those cases, Mara thought she could predict those around her. She thought she understood what motivated Riven. She thought she knew what drove Uldren. She thought she could outsmart Savathun, and her hubris caught her repeatedly. In fact, it would be Uldren's new life as Crow, living as a stranger to her, that forced Mara to consider that her plan of keeping him and her people at arm's length was what got them into this situation to begin with. Her being humbled by Savathun, a witch queen far older and smarter than her, was the final straw that started her down a road of change. It was slow, after all, it's hard to undo an entire lifetime of pride, but she has grown more openly empathetic, allowed herself to be human to those around her rather than a self designed god. And it's a lesson the Awoken had to learn before she could. The Awoken looked down on humanity, the Traveler, Guardians, and their Earthborn cousins, but when push came to shove, they had to call for help from somewhere, and the city was all there was to turn to. It forced barriers to break, made the arrogant humble, and forged bridges where otherwise there wouldn't have been, and most of that had to be done without Mara around to tell them to. The Awoken and the city were already allied by the time Mara returned and took reign of a people that had been moving on without her, and now she and her Awoken are the steadiest allies humanity could ask for. With the union of the two cities forging the backbone of the coalition that would defend our solar system from all threats from beyond. With a history and story like that, one could see how the Awoken are meant to parallel with many other forces. Mara and Savathun act as foils to each other in a pretty obvious way. The Awoken, standing between light and dark, were an early indicator of the story moving towards us as Guardians wielding both light and dark forces, as well as giving some extra meat to the setting so it doesn't feel like we're the only people in it that aren't actively trying to blow up the Traveler. Although Mara has considered doing it before. We all know that if she tried, though, she'd have been turned into a gun by now. So I want you to sit with all this information I just gave you. And now listen to the story of the Exos. Once upon a time, before the collapse, a terrible, awful human being named Clovis Bray I was trying to create robotic people, but couldn't find a way to accurately transplant human consciousness into them. That was until he made contact with the darkness via an artifact on the moon, and followed its instructions to Europa, where he set up shop and also stole a Vex unit from the Ishtar Collective on Venus. Then he made a portal to a Vex Forge Star to study the Vex, and then used Vex Radiolaria combined with darkness to craft the Exos as we understand them. And to prevent the copied minds from rejecting the new bodies, Bray introduced both human mannerisms, such as a desire to eat and reproduce, into their inner workings, and the reboot process, which would subdue older memories to make the current mind and body more acclimated to each other, with each successive reboot being denoted by an additional number after their name, Saint 14, Cade 6, 801, and so on. From then on, until and after the collapse, the Exos integrated into human society. Boom. That's it. See what I mean when I say the Awoken are a people and a culture, while the Exos are a people with the culture of humanity? That's not even a bad thing, really, as the lack of a shared identity has been used to varying degrees for interesting storytelling. Look at Cade 6, who, like many Exo Guardians, had vague memories of his pre-Guardian life and used them as an anchor for himself in hard times. Or how Maya Sundaresh, aka the Conductor, used Exos as experiments, torturing the minds inside who were no less human than you or me, but the ability to reboot them made them valuable for her purposes. Or the GOAT, Banshee 44, the Tower Gunsmith that's been rebooted so many times that he's begun to experience effectively exodementia. And he's also the exified mind of Clovis Bray himself. At least, one of them. Some of you who know the lore better might wonder why I didn't go into the life and story of Clovis Bray or the events that happened on Europa that led to Banshee's creation, and the Vex outbreak that he and Elizabeth Bray had to subdue. But here's the thing. Whenever I go into a deep dive on a central character for one of these videos, whether about Oryx, Keitel, or Mara, it's because those characters have a central story that reflects on the rest of their people. They act as an archetype or a guidepost for the group, mirroring them in development and theme. But the Exos? They don't have that. Clovis is far from representative of the Exos, and the events on Europa weren't known to most of the system, let alone most Exos. And as I said, there's not even a central identity for the Exos to have a focal character for. The closest we might get is Rasputin, the war mind who was also created by Clovis, but again, he isn't representative of the Exos as a whole. It's a matter of two approaches to creating a race or group. One is defined by its history, and the other is defined by its lack of one. The rich story of the Awoken versus the aching homelessness of the Exo. The fight to reclaim what once was theirs, and the journey to either learn what was yours in the first place or to make something for yourself. And in terms of execution and intrigue, it's just a natural consequence that the Awoken will be more interesting as a group. Individual Exo characters can still be fascinating, but only a handful of times is it rooted in them being Exos. More often, it's because of the foundation of them as characters, while Awoken characters like Mara or Petravenge have a history within the story of the Awoken that builds on what we see of them. You could argue that means Exo characters have to put in more work to be compelling, and I'd actually agree to a certain extent. Personally, I'd like it if the Exos had gotten a more developed group identity which we could observe in the story itself. The story of how they came to be and the twisted man behind it is interesting, sure, but that speaks more to the Bray family than it does about the Exos. Like the story of Mara and Uldren Sov speak to the Awoken, or Keitel and Callus speak to the Cabal, or the Hive Gods to the Hive, you get the point. It's an underdeveloped part of the world building in a setting that is frankly overloaded with development at times. No kidding, I couldn't blame you for not knowing half the stuff I talk about in these videos based off just the gameplay, when mountains of lore are left in lore tabs and books. It's been a problem that's waxed and waned throughout Destiny's lifetime. And I get it, it's easier to write in just words all these cool, spectacular events or deeply intricate stories than it is to create cutscenes, hire voice actors, and set up game environments for that to take place. Really, I get it. But at a certain point, you have to bite the bullet, pay the bill, and let us see those events ourselves, and fair is fair, we've gotten more of that as time has gone on. Of course, it's dipped in recent months post-Final Shape, with Heresy being the kick in the pants we have been wanting, but that's a familiar trend, isn't it? The game grinding to a halt only for it to get a jolt of life again. That's not healthy, though. It's not a natural story growth. It's the writing equivalent of being brain dead and occasionally getting shock therapy. The comparison between the Awoken and the Exo is part and parcel with the nature of Destiny's story, and while good exists in both, I find it hard to argue that there isn't a fundamental problem with how they go about making the story and what they choose to focus on. The Awoken have gotten 4 seasons and 2 expansions to themselves, and the Exos have only really gotten part of one expansion to have their collective identity expanded on. So maybe give the Exo writers some time in the kitchen. Surely it can't be worse than whatever the Vex are getting up to until Echoes happened. Every story has a beginning, and every story has an ending. And wrapped up in both is the arrogant demand to carve a singular purpose into all of existence. To demand all life bend to the whims of mortal minds, fooling themselves into thinking they're a god. And yet with all that power, they could do nothing about that mega-mind looking forehead. The cosmology of Destiny, as I've said previously, is prone to background bloat, especially when that leads to hefty chunks of vital lore happening in lore tabs or lore books. Some of these are fantastic, don't misunderstand, but putting too much in the background can leave the foreground a bit bare. This was the core of the flaws of early Destiny's story, and it popped up now and again in Destiny 2. That and a lack of focus. Mix them together and Destiny kind of meandered around for a while without a sense of direction. Sure, we all enjoyed the Taken King or the Red War, but without a sense of where the story was going, it meant that there was no anticipation for some grand future event that kept people at least paying attention to the story over time. You know, the Thanos effect. But with the introduction of the pyramid ships and the slow buildup of some grander villain behind the enemies we'd fought up to this point, Destiny's story began to gain the momentum it needed, and at the center of that was the villain in question. A villain of such monumental presence and impact within the story that I genuinely believe Bungie will struggle to properly replace it. The darkness that always returns. The one who we've chased from the very beginning. Panics! Okay, no, but it'd be incredibly funny if he was canonically part of it. Also, insert Kelgarath joke here. Yeah, he comes back nearly as much as Tannix does, if we're being honest. But if we're being strictly serious, I am of course referring to the Witness. The mind behind the Hive's creation, the Elixni's dispersion, the rebellion of a part of the Vex, the command of the Taken after Oryx and Savathûn, and the shaper of the newest enemy faction, the Dread, who are the reshaped forms of various other species the Witness has encountered and molded to serve it. Practically every inch of Destiny's story has been touched by the pale hand of the Witness. So for this final video covering the primary groups and influences of Destiny's story, it feels only appropriate to end with the piece of the puzzle that defined an era of the game's story, the impact it had, and where, if anywhere, the story can go without it. In a time incomprehensibly in the past, on a desolate planet, where a hopeless, weary people barely scraping to live, when they discovered a glimmer of light. Digging from the primordial earth, they found themselves a god, a beacon, a gardener, to fill their empty world with life and give them a paradise unto themselves. Over the untold millennia that this gardener stayed with them, they created a gargantuan spacefaring civilization, led by a consensus of thinkers and leaders. One capable of technological feats we'd compare to the light itself, such as the creation of entire worlds. But this gift of light and civilization was given without instructions, without a message to accompany it. And so these people, these precursors, sought meaning. Various groups within the civilization experimented with and sought ways to define meaning with the light, whether through using it as a tool or a weapon. But ultimately, they determined that light itself was a force of ambivalent chaos, like nature itself, ever growing and providing, but with no care for the end result. As a people, the idea of a winnower took shape, a concept they wanted to come and carve purpose into the chaotic garden offered to them, to bring it into a perfect, complete, final shape. However, no one could actually agree on what this final shape would look like. Some thought it required the end of all life, some wanted to uplift the entire universe into a higher state of being, some thought that the true final shape was the shape you brought yourself to, and some, the most dangerous, believed it was a state of imposed order that would bring an end of suffering, free of change or pain. These differences caused infighting and rivalry between these groups, but just as that purpose was desired, they discovered a second half of the equation. The Veil, a conduit of a different power, a power that represented the mind and the consciousness. With this, they realized, in combination with the gardener's power that ruled the physical world, they could mold both the internal and external of the very universe. And they attempted this, only for the gardener to disprove. For the first time, it let its feelings be known by abandoning the precursors for trying to use its power to restrict creation. And that was when the gardener became the traveler. And the precursors lost their marbles. Enraged and rather entitled, they lashed out at each other and their fleeing god. The way forward was then carved from conflict, as the opposing factions were annihilated by the most extreme, those who wanted to force salvation at the edge of a knife. They would then bring all that remains of their civilization together, and with the veil, they would cut away all that divided them, all thoughts that contradicted, erased, all minds brought to consensus, congregated, all eyes made to bear witness. With the mass death of the greatest civilization our universe may ever know, came the birth of the greatest evil it ever knew, the child of countless minds converging into each other, mutilated and condensed by darkness into a malevolent will defined by suffocating purpose and malignant resentment, a being of 1,000 names, but one we all know: the Witness. And with the paracausal power of darkness suffused in every last remnant of their civilization, the Witness set out in pursuit of the Traveler and brought the armada of the Black Fleet behind it. And in the process, it began meeting many other species, all who lived meager lives compared to it. So it offered its help, its godlike technology and knowledge, but few accepted, and those that did wanted it for themselves or feared the Witness entirely. So it simply continued on in its collective solitude, until it met the Eurythmia, a loving race that welcomed them with open arms into their civilization. One touched, as they learned, by the Traveler's light. The gardener, their gardener, had chosen another, replaced them. The rage that overcame the Witness drew it to erase the kind Eurythmia, and as the last of their kind died, as the Traveler fled, the Eurythmia did not hate them. They left this universe with a smile and kindness. And on that day, in horror of what they'd done, the first dissenter was cut away. A dissenter, as they and the Witness called them, is a consciousness within the Witness that has rejected what they have become, and so has been cordoned off inside the Witness or outside of it in certain artifacts. A means to remove doubts and create the illusion of unity. But as the eons wore on, little by little the number of dissenters grew, and more were severed from the Witness. But never completely, as to do so would weaken the Witness's power. After the Eurythmia, the Witness's methods seemed to have changed. It became more vindictive, almost more enthralled with the spectacle, determined to prove the lie of the gardener, that its gifts only led to disorder and pain, to make every species that its light touched learn that lesson with brutality. It didn't have to do this, of course. It had more power than any civilization it came across. It could just wipe them out before they realized what was happening or moved on as it chased the Traveler. But that wasn't good enough. The Witness had to make them despair, to drown them in a blanket of dark anguish just as they had been. To facilitate this, and to extend its reach, the witness began selecting individuals from certain races blessed by the traveler and directing them in the annihilation of said races by the will of its philosophy, and modeling them in darkness, transforming them into its disciples. Rulk destroyed the star of his home world and was reborn as a disciple, and later was used to subjugate the worm gods of Fundament, as I mentioned in the Hive video. Sometime later, Nezarec would be selected as the disciple of his people before their presumed annihilation, and given his own pyramid ship as well. It would raise up the Hive gods and trick them into targeting the Traveler as well, creating another arm to reach out and strike at the god who it had long since grown to hate. And all the Hive would bring would be an extension of that original deceit. It would also encounter the banished Cabal Emperor Callus and grant him a vision of the end of all things, which would in turn become his sole purpose. And somewhere along the line, a portion of the Vex network would splinter off to worship the darkness and by extension begin listening to the Witness, that fancied itself the true champion of darkness. The storm that was the Witness continued its violent crusade, obliterating species after species, sundering the planet of Rees, and scattering the Elixni in chase of the Traveler, and, of course, it would lead the Witness's Black Fleet to Earth. And as I've detailed several times before, with Nezarec and Savathun, Hive God of Trickery, leading the way, it would again close in on the Traveler. But two unexpected things happened that day. Firstly, Savathun would betray Nezarec and kill him before spiriting the Veil that he was escorting into hiding. And more shocking for all involved, no doubt, was that for the first time in its billion years of history, the sole moment across the thousands of chosen people, this time, the Traveler did not run. This time, the Traveler fought back, and the surge of light struck back at the Black Fleet with such force it warped reality as the paracausal forces collided and wounded the Traveler to near death, as well as dispelling the fleet from the system. Believing the Veil missing, the Witness left the inert Traveler to search for it. As the stories I've told before continued under the sleeping Gardener's shadow, the Witness's search in the Beyond is largely undocumented and therefore can be assumed to be uneventful, although I suppose this could be the time frame of when it actually encountered Callus. But it largely left the solar system alone to the many other horrors assailing it, until the Red War, when the Traveler woke back up, and a shockwave of light expanded across the galaxy and beyond, alerting the Black Fleet. From then on, the clock was ticking as the Witness's presence grew bit by bit every year. Savathun's machinations to escape its grasp, Callus's arrival into the system, the awakening of Nezarec's latent power that summoned nightmares on the moon, all of it because of the certain arrival of the Witness. Its Black Fleet arrived first, occupying various points in the system, while others, like the one on the moon or Europa, appear to have been left behind during the collapse. Those last two are vital because they were how we first started interacting with the Witness, long before we learned what it was, and when we thought it was the darkness itself, aka back before Bungie figured out what they wanted the Witness to be. I suppose I could just be assuming that, but it's kind of the vibe I get. By the way, a bit of a clarification, as has been shouted to me by everyone under the sun, the Unveiling lorebook, at least seemingly, is the actual words of the Winnower/Darkness or whatever you want to call it. However, various sources that I investigated through this whole process disagreed on that. People have had plenty of debates as to the legitimacy of whether it was the Witness or the Winnower who gave us the book, and back in my earlier videos I assumed the Unveiling book was given to us by the Witness, since we get it in the same expansion and time frame as we first encounter the Witness's presence in the Moon Pyramid. Now, however, I think I can safely say that Unveiling is from the Winnower's perspective. But after spending way too long reading through lore forums and discussions, I've come to this conclusion. I have no idea what's going on here. Maybe the Witness was impersonating the Winnower, maybe the Winnower was impersonating the Witness, maybe Bungie hadn't figured out whether they wanted the Witness and Winnower to be two separate entities by that point, and maybe the Witness sent us Unveiling but it was written by the Winnower. I don't know. Some evidence from the Entelechy lore book suggests that, at least to the characters in the universe, they believe the Unveiling book to be the words of the Winnower itself. And I learned that not from any of those prior lore discussions, but from reading the book itself while researching for this video. So, the final conclusion of this mini-rant is this. Reddit is useless. Moving on, our first words with the Witness were actually through our ghost, which it showed to be able to control from afar. which makes some sense. Ghosts are basically extensions of the Traveler that channel its paracausal power, and the Witness is effectively channeling itself through them instead. I think, anyway. That's just a theory. A game theory! Thanks for watching. No, it just isn't the same, man. Through the ghost, and with visions of a concerning nature, the Witness offered peace, security, and most importantly, salvation. It offered the same to the Elixni of Europa, such as Aramis, who turned to the very whirlwind that destroyed her home, blinded by bitterness as the Witness was, and was pointed at the Traveler, all while Sivu Arath, in total obedience to her sword logic, started doing what all good hive gods do and made everything significantly worse. All for a sword logic that the Witness hilariously considered to be a paltry mockery of the winnowing it believed in. Just don't tell it that the actual winnower prefers the hive. The Witness's plans got a bit twisted by Savathun yet again, when she abandoned the ways of the hive and was gifted the light, trapping Rolk inside her throne world and laying the foundations for the Guardians to later kill him after her death. Granted, Savathun didn't exactly plan on dying to the Guardians or learning that her entire life was a lie concocted by the Witness, but she was always the type to have backup plans for her backup plans. By this point, though, the Witness was almost in the system and was within arm's reach of the Traveler and the Veil, and it almost immediately began showing off why we were afraid of it for so long. Tanking the only attack the Traveler has ever performed on screen, commanding an entire fleet with a finger, and turning 3 Guardians into 30 Guardians. Then it hangs out floating in front of the Traveler, who is probably very sick of being stuck in bondage for like the 4th time, while it lets Callus do the job poorly for it. I didn't say it was a perfect plan, but when in Lightfall, you work with what you got. Still worked out, even though Callus fumbled the bag over and over again, since it results in us being close enough for our ghost to be used to establish the link, because in that instance we just casually ignored the fact the Witness has repeatedly possessed our ghost and even projected its power through it before, but again, when in Lightfall, we work with what we get. Digression aside, the Witness entered the Traveler's core, the Pale Heart, and began trying to wrestle control from it, which seems like the hardest part of this whole process for it. Everything up to this point has been rather effortless when the Witness does it, but the Traveler's will is harder to break, but not impossible, as it was able to, if only for a moment, force the world into the final shape it wanted. A calcified reality trapped eternally in a single unchanging moment. No chaos, no freedom, no suffering, and no forward progress. A perfect, final shape. Roll credits. With the plans and machinations of Savathun, Riven, and Marasov all leading to Crow acting as an anchor by which we could follow into the Pale Heart, the final war against the Witness began in earnest. We channeled light and dark at once, communed with the Traveler itself. Zavala got mega depressed and made some very stupid but technically correct decisions, and even Kate came back thanks to Ahamkara magic. I really wish I could talk about more of all that, but there's only so much time. We'd be here all day if I discussed every intricacy of the Final Shape story, so for simplicity's sake, things got hectic inside the Traveler, and based on its regular screaming that we could hear, it wasn't a very comfortable experience for the big golf ball. It was here, with even the light at its fingertips, that the Witness crafted its own personal army. A perfect army of its own. The Dread, taking various races that had succumbed to it and molding their physical forms with light and their minds with darkness. The Dread are, well, if we're being honest, a little less interesting than everything else going on, but for their purposes at the time and for later, they're perfectly functional. A solid B+, though from what I hear they got more spice and heresy, which I've yet to finish. There's just, never enough time. But as for the Dread themselves, they have aspects of Scions who defected from Keitel's empire, Fallen from the House of Salvation, and the Tormentors and Subjugators being fashioned based off Nezarec and Rolk respectively. But the Grim are perhaps the cruelest, as they were created from the shattered minds of dissenters within the Witness, with each shattered piece forming a Grim, with the pieces trying to hover around each other to grasp onto what remains of their minds. But every Grim we kill cuts away their memories until who they were is lost forever. Every single Dread has a similar story, as they were flayed and inverted while still alive under the surgical and bloody hands of the Witness, and then turned against us as the shock of what they've been turned into means they don't even really understand what's happening to their bodies, except in brief moments of lucidity. If only the Witness could have been made to see the same, but it cut away those parts so it didn't have to. And yet, it still felt fear. Here in the heart of its great enemy, with its hands drenched in both blood and light, the Witness was afraid, because it knew just how much power the Guardians and their ghosts could wield inside. Because for as powerful as the Witness was, we'd proven ourselves incapable of being predicted, and so instead, as it tried to do many times before, it attempted to lure us in with promises of everything from power to glory to, well, let's be honest, treasure and loot. Because, let's be honest, it's kind of obvious what the Guardians are all about. But luckily for the universe at large, none of the prompting worked. And similarly, the parts within the Witness that it couldn't convince called out to us as well. And though stupidly reckless and ultimately leading to the death of his ghost Targe, Zavala seeks out the dissenter's words as he's lost faith in the Traveler entirely. But the price paid was more than made up for with what we learned, as we were given the means to win. The Witness's power comes from the union of every mind within it, compounding their mental and paracausal power, so all one would have to do is cut out the individual pieces until the whole becomes weakened. That is the secret the Dissenters showed us at the recreated site of the Witness's birth, and with the Traveler fighting back even now, it manifested artifacts of light to protect us, and to be its claws cutting back at its original children. Diving within the darkness of the Witness, but with a piece of the Traveler's might in our hands, we could cut the Dissenters one at a time, and truly injure the Witness. We ultimately have to get the heck out of Dodge, since we finally managed to make the Eldritch frat house angry, but by then Mara and the Coalition have managed to get into the Pale Heart behind us, which means now it's our army against its. Also, there was the raid, but good luck beating that one even with a fire team, so let's just pretend it's not there because I'm a filthy solo player most of the time. There's also a quick detour of Cade being his awesome self again, handing the reins of the Hunter Vanguard title to Crow, and giving us the most obvious boss killer weapon ever, but it's not really pertinent to the Witness. I just wanted to mention it because I love that Cade came back. After 10 years of in-game build-up and in-lore unfathomable eons of history, the Witness is a hair's breadth away from its goal. The culmination of everything that the ultimate civilization wanted, just as all those it screwed over to get here came knocking on its door to remind it that it's not the only one that matters in this universe. An army of Guardians, humanity, Hive, Elixni, Cabal, and Awoken all standing side by side against Taken, Scorn, Vex, Dread, and the one who set it all in motion so long ago. A crashing of two ideals. One that demands all bend to the imperfect, hypocritical, and arrogant whims of a people that is quite literally tearing itself apart, and the other that says even in the face of the chaos, they choose to move forward through it, rather than forcing everyone else to conform. And in the end, when we stare down the Witness in its truest form, as an abominable beast that wears darkness as a cloak and who suffocates even parts of itself, the Traveler is there with us as well. In us, in our ghost, all around us, and channeling that light through our ghosts as an extension of the Traveler, we shatter the almighty architect of our collapse, freeing those trapped inside and leaving the Witness with only one thing left to say.
I don't understand.
And how could it ever? It shut its eyes to that which contradicted it. It shut up and shut out the Dissenters, and thought itself so much better that it was its right to force its salvation down our throats. But salvation that is forced is no salvation at all, and as the great pretender falls, the chase the Traveler has endured for so long comes to a close, with the 10-year story Destiny has led to. It's hard to quite quantify what the hole that the Witness, and by extension the end of the Light and Dark saga, have left. It reminds me again of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, reaching an endgame and yet still trying to continue in spite of reaching such a perfect finale. I'd argue Destiny is doing a fair bit better than the MCU is right now, but still. They've introduced the Echoes, shards of light and dark that broke from the Witness and Traveler upon the former's death, establishing not only an enormous power vacuum but a means by which it could be filled, creating tension around who might try to fill it, particularly with the Dread now leaderless and able to act in ways we can't predict. Execution of this idea has been spotty, however, as the 3 stories we've gotten since then have ranged from boring in gameplay and interesting in theory, to unbearable in gameplay and infuriating in story, to actually entertaining gameplay and fascinating narrative developments. Destiny's been caught spinning its wheels before, and though I've never been the type to just write off Destiny 1 as being better purely based off nostalgia, I can't help but see that in those days, the game felt alive even when the story was halted. Maybe that's rose-tinted glasses. It's always possible. But I felt a similar feeling during the seasons following Shadowkeep and Beyond Light. Continuous progression, sure, but also a comfort with where it was at the time, such that we the players could enjoy the game at the same time. No mandatory replaying of the same exotic mission 3 or 4 times with no major variations. Story and character developments feeling impactful even without world-shaking stakes, and a gameplay loop that was satisfying and could keep us entertained without jangling a new mechanic in our face every 4 months. A new game mode or activity, sure, but I did not have to patrol menus so much back in Season of the Dawn or Chosen. Then there's the behind-the-scenes issues I mentioned all the way back at the end of my first Destiny video. Extensive and unnecessary layoffs while Bungie execs show off a disconnect with their audience. Not to mention irritating levels of microtransactions that, while avoidable as I've never really engaged with them save for purchasing the seasons, are hard to just write off. I've been rather lenient with Destiny over these videos, I think. I've shared my criticism, but overall I think I've cut them slack. However, I would be dishonest if I pretended that every positive I spoke about existed in a vacuum. They don't. They exist alongside years of mismanagement, unfairness towards their employees, meandering storytelling, bloated background lore, and several confusing story choices. So, in the spirit of honesty and fairness, here's some negatives. Related to this video, the treatment of the Witness is clearly confused in earlier lore and story. Obviously, back in Shadowkeep, the writers hadn't settled in on what they wanted the Witness to be, which causes confusion and uncertainty when we talk about it. Not to mention there are several times when the Witness is too hands-off in my opinion. Why did it send Callus to retrieve the Veil when it could easily overpower our entire army with ease? That's not the only critique either, as more exist for the other groups. I've expressed my problems with the Vex and Exos, but as for the other groups, the Elixni's writing has become more and more confused and muddled as time goes on, as they attempt to write them as just refugees trying to make a home for themselves, when that was never what they were in story or gameplay. They were raiders, pirates. They were sympathetic, to be sure, but why does Bungie try to force this narrative of the Elixni victim-blaming humanity for just existing near the Traveler and not wanting them to kill them all and steal it back? And then painting those Elixni as having a point? Excuse me? The Scorn have been irrelevant even during the Revenants episode where they took center stage as the villains, and with Fikrul gone, I don't anticipate many interesting things coming from them anytime soon. Callus was totally misused in Lightfall, with more emphasis put on Rocky-esque training montages than our main antagonist and the eldritch horror he's trapped himself with. And the primary Vex network, not the Soul Divisive or the new Vex on Nessus, continue to do a whole lot of nothing. I get that they exist beyond time and don't have to worry about succeeding now when they have eternity, but just because you have an explanation for it doesn't make it more interesting or make them more threatening as a villain. We have to see it. And it's all just exhausting. There's a reason that the final shape was where plenty of veteran Destiny players called it quits. They'd reached the decade-long climax they'd been waiting for and were comfortable setting down their controllers. And I was largely among them. Until I started work on these videos, I hadn't consistently played the game in well over 6 to 7 months. I still hadn't finished Echoes or Revenant, much less Heresy. Honestly, it's hard to justify doing otherwise. Bungie has spun Destiny around for close to a year following the final shape, and only gave it the attention it deserves when the game started to tumble down again, dragging it and the fanbase back and forth, barely stringing it along to avoid total collapse. It's sad, really, watching this game that was a major part of my life for so long get mishandled by people who just want a paycheck, while the people actually responsible for making the game what it is are sidelined and even fired for their hard work. So, yeah, at a certain point, you've got to step away. To tell yourself you're not going to run your head against the wall over and over again, exhausting yourself without a break. Which is rather appropriate, since that's the same feeling behind why I'm planning to take a step back from YouTube. Not a step away, just a step back for a bit. I have found that in my efforts to be consistent and productive, to put out a video every week on the exact day, I've let other things fall to the side. I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't made a countdown or a classic video essay in months, both of which are styles of videos I want to keep making regardless of the views. I started this channel because I wanted to get my voice out there and talk about the stuff I loved, and while I've been doing that, this format, uploading strictly every week for just short of a year, has been exhausting and has drained time away from other projects. Not to mention, I've got a real-life job that also takes up a portion of my week, meaning I have to plan all sorts of things incredibly closely together, and it doesn't always work out. And I almost break myself over making some of these videos, cutting it down to the wire. I've seen the pitfalls of YouTubers before me, letting the grind wear them down until they do it more out of obligation than passion, and grow dissatisfied with their work. And it's that same reason that I move on to different settings for these tour guides when I'm done, so I don't pigeonhole myself into one spot without moving. I've got a lot to talk about, and I don't want to let the algorithm or whatever push me to being just one kind of creator. So, yeah. Once this video goes up, and then the complete tour guide the week after, you might not hear from me for a bit. I'm sorry if that disappoints some of you, but I need to give myself time to breathe after almost a year of going non-stop. Same reason I stepped back from Destiny for a while, and just like that, I'll still be here and keeping up. I'll post videos, always on Saturday, and trying to keep improving as a creator. I just won't be as consistent with it. In the meantime, I want to thank all my patrons and channel members, whose generous gifts keep me feeling motivated even as exhaustion sets in. I hope you keep supporting me even during this period, but regardless of if you don't, I thank you for the support you've given me this far. Now, as always, I am and will always be the Hearth Guy. And say it with me now. I will see you all next time around the hearth.